Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku mastered the power of the 10 shadows part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗵𝗃 from Wattpad. So let's start the video. Third person POV, July 15th, 2339. Late in the evening inside a hospital room, in the maternity ward of Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital, a woman lets out a scream as she pushes with all her might. It had been a long and difficult 15 hours, but finally, her baby boy was born. The woman, a woman with naturally moss-green hair and eyes like emeralds, looked with lidded eyes at the medical staff surrounding her, then at the small human held tightly in the hands of a nearby nurse. The small bundle seemed to lay peacefully, not crying or making a scene. Looking at the new life, the woman lets a weak smile creep onto her face. Breathing a sigh of relief at the end of the difficult LBR, the woman shut her eyes and offered a small, silent prayer. Nurse 1, Mrs. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃, it's a boy. Do you have a name decided? The nurse holding the newborn asked, looking at the woman sitting on the chair, her legs still in the stirrups. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃. Yes, I do. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃, the mother who had just given 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃, looked at the nurse and answered. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 was struggling to catch her breath. Nurse 1, and the father? The nurse asked, looking at the green-haired woman. 𝗳𝗵𝗃 was growing paler as she spoke. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃. He's not here right now, he's overseas working? 𝗳𝗵𝗃 replied, looking away slightly. I can't answer that question truthfully. 𝗳𝗃𝗁𝗃 is? 𝗳𝗵𝗃 thought to herself. Reaching her arms out for her newborn baby boy, 𝗳𝗵𝗃 smiled at the nurse to try and disarm her. The nurse, heeding the unspoken request, handed over the newborn to his mother. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃. He's so small, he's so cute, 𝗳𝗵𝗃 spoke to herself as she looked down at the baby boy in her arms. Hello, Izuku. 𝗳𝗵𝗃 spoke with a smile, her eyes glittering as she watched the newborn open his eyes and look up at her. It was at that moment that 𝗳𝗵𝗃 swore to herself that she would never leave her little boy alone. She would always be there for and with him, no matter what. 𝗳𝗵𝗃 looked down at the little boy in her arms and watched as he closed his eyes and dozed off once again. Eventually came the time to hand the newborn back to the nurse and close her eyes herself. Getting a little bit of rest. 𝗳𝗵𝗃. 𝗳𝗃𝗃, I hope you're not hurt, please come home soon and safe. Izuku and I are going to need you, I can't do it alone. A few weeks later inside the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 home, with 𝗳𝗵𝗃, Izuku, and 𝗳𝗃𝗃, it had been a few weeks since Izuku's 𝗵𝗃𝗃 and 𝗳𝗵𝗃's return to her and 𝗳𝗃𝗃's shared apartment. A few days after she returned home from the hospital, 𝗳𝗵𝗃's husband and Izuku's father, 𝗳𝗃𝗃 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃, had returned from his work trip. 𝗳𝗃𝗃, a quirkless man, whose family had been pretty much scrubbed from the face of the earth. One of the last of the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 family, a family who had been famous around the time of the emergence of quirks in society. The 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 name carried with it a weight, as it was the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 family who contributed quite a large amount to the research of quirks, or meta abilities as they were called, during the appearance of these powers. 𝗳𝗃𝗃 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃, a well-built man, whose body was littered with scars and injuries, had arrived home from a trip to northern Japan. 𝗳𝗃𝗃 knew that his wife was 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 when he left. He hadn't expected her to give 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃 while he was away. He had received an emergency contract and as such went to Fukushima to take care of some work for the 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃, who had contacted him. Upon returning home, 𝗳𝗃𝗃 was greeted with the sounds of his wife, 𝗳𝗵𝗃, quietly speaking in hushed tones. Wondering who she could be speaking to, 𝗳𝗃𝗃 made his way to where his wife was sitting. As he approached, she turned over her shoulder and raised a finger to her lips to signal him to keep quiet. 𝗳𝗃𝗃 looked at his wife, dumbfounded, until he looked just beyond her. On the floor in a puddle of black and white fur, lay a newborn baby boy, who had signs of dark green hair beginning to grow atop his scalp. The thing that confuses 𝗳𝗃𝗃 is the fur. 𝗳𝗵𝗃. Shoo, he's sleeping, 𝗳𝗵𝗃 said as she smiled at her husband and looked back at the baby sleeping on the floor. 𝗳𝗃𝗃. 𝗳𝗵𝗃. 𝗳𝗃𝗃 began to speak, looking at his wife and then back at the baby. Wait, is that? 𝗳𝗃𝗃 asked, looking at his wife, gauging her reaction to his realization. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 simply smiled again and nodded at her husband. Turning back, and looking at Izuku sleeping peacefully in the bundle of fur on the floor. Tsuji looked at his wife, then at his son. He wanted to ask what those piles of fur or hair were, but right now he would let his newborn rest, along with his wife. Tsuji took a deep breath and then sat on the couch beside his wife. Pulling her in close and resting her head on his shoulder, Tsuji looked at his wife's appealing green eyes. Tsuji, I'll keep them out of harm's way if it's the last thing I do, Tsuji thought as he looked at the two in front of him. About half an hour later, Tsuji sat and listened to his wife's steady breathing as she napped on his shoulder. Tsuji has moved Issei to the crib in the living room. As Tsuji turned around after placing Izuku into his crib, the black and white piles of fur had disappeared. Tsuji, what the hell? Tsuji thought in surprise. Suddenly turning over his shoulder and looked at Izuku's crib, where he had heard a sound only a few moments before. As Tsuji looked, he saw it. He got two answers to his questions at the same time. Those ball of fur were now sitting watching over the crib like guard animals. Tsuji's eyes widened as he saw a stark white wolf and a dark black wolf watching him, 𝗬𝗵𝗲, and Izuku with focused eyes. Tsuji, no way, Tsuji thought to himself as he looked at the two wolves, who returned his gaze with a silent warning not to approach the slumbering newborn. This changes things. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. Years later, inside a home in Mustafu, Japan, Izuku woke with a start. It was a normal occurrence for him. He would regularly have nightmares. It didn't take long for Shiro and Kumo to wake up as well. The two wolves had been with Izuku for as long as he could remember. The white one, Shiro, had a penitent for getting the three of them into trouble sometimes. Meanwhile, Kuma, the dark black wolf, usually attempted to maintain some semblance of discipline between the group members. The three had been inseparable from the time Izuku was less than a month old. They never let him go too long without butting themselves into whatever he was doing. Shaking his head, Izuku reached out, patted both wolves on the head, and pulled both back into his shadow. Izuku didn't have to worry about them for now. Getting up out of bed and stretching, Izuku looked at his room. While most kids around his age hung posters of their favorite hero or maybe even their favorite television or game character, Izuku had left his room fairly bare. Izuku had never really been overly interested in heroes or many other things. Unlike his cousin, or technically, sister he supposed. Izuku's cousin, Izumi, was the same age as he was. She was just a few months older. She and Izuku were clear opposites. While Izuku was calm and usually collected, Izumi was overly excitable and enthusiastic. Izumi had a huge respect and admiration for heroes, often fangirling for her favorite heroes. While Izumi was quirkless, she still loved and wanted to be a hero as much as, if not more than anyone else around her. Izuku had been living with Izumi and her mother Inko, ever since his own mother. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, who was Inko's younger sister, had passed away 2 years ago. Izuku's father was nowhere to be found. He had left not long after Izuku's first birthday. After 𝗬𝗵𝗲's death, Inko had received custody of Izuku as one of his only remaining relatives. Izuku, what time is it? Issei thought as he looked at the alarm clock sitting on his bedside table. It read 7:05 a.m., and Izuku let out a small groan as he got up off of his bed. Izuku knew that he had school today, and if he didn't get up soon, one of the green-haired women would come and get him. Getting up and getting dressed, Izuku made his way down to the dining table to wait for Izumi to finish in the bathroom. Once she had finished, Izuku got bathed and dressed before joining the two greenettes for breakfast. After breakfast, Izuku and Izumi made their way to school with Inko for the day. On the way, they met up with their neighbor and Izumi's childhood friend and bully, Katsuki Bakugo, who was walking with his mother, Mitsuki Bakugo. After walking to school, the group of three enters and makes their way to the class, bidding farewell to their parents as they enter. Izuku wasn't looking forward to another day of school. He wasn't treated very well by his classmates, strictly due to the nature of his quirk. Although, Izuku was thankful he didn't have it as bad as Izumi did. Izuku still remembered when he first moved to his aunt Inko's, and how distraught his cousin Izumi was at her lack of a quirk. He remembered their days playing at the local park, and the torment Katsuki, a neighborhood bully and Izumi's childhood friend, would level at her for her quirklessness. Izuku wasn't sure why, nor did he understand. As such, he simply ignored it at first. The comments of their classmates began to simply roll off Izumi's back, and Izuku found it to be admirable. Izumi stood, strong and steadfast in her dream of being a hero as well. Her obsession with All Might was beyond healthy, if you asked Izuku. The comments aimed at Izuku, however, bothered him. Boy 1, isn't that the boy with the scary wolves? Izuku, Shiro and Kuma aren't scary. Boy 2, I heard it's called a toast, my mom said they're parasites. Izuku, huh? What even is a parasite? Girl 1, he's mean just like his wolves. Izuku, I'm not mean, right? Girl 2, isn't he Izumi's brother? I wonder what it's like for him to live with Izumi. Izuku, she's no different from anyone else. Izuku wasn't sure what to make of their comments. He was pretty sure he wasn't mean, and as such, neither were Shiro and Kuma. So he didn't understand why they were saying that about him. He had stood up and defended Izumi once, and Shiro had responded in kind. Maybe that's what it was. Years later, Mustafu, Japan, with Izuku and Izumi. Izuku and Izumi were making their way through Mustafu on their way to Aldra Junior High as a massive commotion was taking place. A large crowd of people stood in the middle of the walkway and looked up at the tracks for the metro. As Izuku and Izumi come closer, Izumi takes off in a sprint to try and get closer to the action and see it firsthand. Izuku picks up his pace to match the excitable hero fangirl he calls a sister and approaches a police blockade, preventing people from entering the crowd and increasing the number of civilian lives the pro-heroes have to take into account. On the tracks above Tetouan Station was a large villain with a shark-like appearance who was blocking the tracks and any trains from leaving. The villain thrashed about and shouted angrily at anyone who seemed to come too close, eventually smacking and ripping an electrical tower out of the ground and toward the crowd of civilians below. Screams and shouts of terrified bystanders ring out as the large metal structure makes its way toward the ground below. Rushing from the side, a man with white hair and a costume that left the front of his torso revealed. Black and white caution-styled accessories adorned his outfit. The man slammed his fists together, causing a small spark of electricity to arc as he reached upward and caught the falling metal structure, preventing it from hitting any innocent bystanders and causing major damage to city infrastructure. With a grunt of effort, the man manages to raise the metal above his head and set it to the side, dusting himself off as civilians around offer praises of the hero's work. Civilian 1, oh, that's 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗏, a man said in awe. Civilian 2, he carries out justice through his great physical strength, someone else chimed in, the punching hero. In front of the crowd, a stream of water emerged and blocked anyone from moving forward into dangerous areas where they might fall victim to collateral damage. Everyone, this is dangerous. A man in a firefighter costume with fire hydrant-like mechanisms where his hands should be. This was the source of the water cordon. Stay back. Stay back. Civilian 3, the rescue specialist, Backdraft, is here, too, another man shouted. Izuku watched Izumi closely as she tried to peer around the crowd for a better look at the action and the heroes who would be present to take on this threat. He couldn't help but listen to some of the comments of the onlookers, most of which seemed to scathe him about his actions with the quirk he possessed. Apparently, the villain in question had simply snatched a purse but grew as large as he did when he had been cornered. Izuku watched Izumi push her way through some of the bystanders. Knowing she might disappear if he lets her out of his sight for too long, Izuku follows Izumi into the crowd, pushing his way through the gathered bodies to find his sister and make sure she doesn't end up lost or injured in some way. He had promised his aunt Inko he would watch out for Izumi a long time ago, and he intended to fulfill what he promised. As Izuku had caught up to Izumi, a shadow had passed overhead. Soon Izuku was able to see to whom that shadow belonged, as he heard a group of women squealing in the distance and shouting, "Fangirls, you can do it, 𝗵𝗄𝗏." Izuku managed to watch the wooden hero make his way up onto the overpass where the villain was still rampaging. Quickly dodging a haphazard strike and launching himself into the air above the villain, 𝗵𝗄𝗏 attempted to get close. 𝗵𝗄𝗏 was pushed back as the villain yelled at him to get away and swiped his hand through the air at the hero. Izumi and Izuku had managed to make their way through the entire crowd and to the front, where Izumi watched wide-eyed and excited about what was to happen. "Izumi, who's fighting?" Izumi asked, looking up at the overpass at the battle taking place. She slowly reached into her school bag for something. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 had managed to dodge the attack by 𝗬𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗍 himself back by one of the wooden tendrils grown from his arm. Izumi and Izuku watched with differing levels of admiration the amount of agility and control 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 had over his quirk. "Izumi, 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 Woods?" Izumi said, growing more excited as time went on. Her hair shook as she also trembled with excitement as she continued, "The young and talented rising star. You were the one asking," a man who stood next to Izumi spoke, crossing his arms and closing his eyes. The man had strange protrusions on both sides of his head, near his temples, and on the crown of his head as well. "But you gave a perfect commentary, kid. You're a fangirl, aren't you?" The man turned, smiling and pointing at Izumi as he asked. "Izumi, well," Izumi blushed, turning away as she grew embarrassed. "Izuku, yes. Yes, you are." Izuku mumbled, looking at the green-haired girl from the corner of his eyes. Izumi, Izuku, and the rest of the crowd watched with bated breath as 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 Woods continued to fight the villain atop the train tracks. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 began speaking, however they were too far away to be able to make out what it was that 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 was saying. They could see, however, that 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 had stretched one of his arms out and a large group of wooden tendrils seemed to be forming from his arm, as if he were prepping a large-scale attack of some sort. "Izumi, oh," Izumi shouted, pointing at 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵 and drawing both Izuku and the nearby onlookers' attention to what she saw. "Here it comes. Show us something flashy, tree man," the man who spoke to Izumi shouted. Izumi, preemptive, 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵, binding Izumi and 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵. Lacquered chain prison. Preemptive binding lacquered chain prison, as a large group of wooden tendrils extended from 𝗵𝗄𝗄𝐵's arm and toward the villain, footsteps could be heard. Heavy footsteps to be exact. Cannon. A massive shadow passed overhead as a woman the size of a building went flying toward the villain, her legs outstretched in a drop kick. Her feet connected with the man before 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵's wooden tendrils were able to secure him. A large blonde woman in a spandex bodysuit and purple eye mask had kicked the villain, knocking him off of the train tracks and knocking him out cold. All of the bystanders, including the pro-heroes, stood in stunned silence as they simply waited for whatever was to come next. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐵? Izuku watched as the woman stood up over the villain, and then as she turned over her shoulder, Izuku was suddenly surrounded by men with cameras of various quality and expense, taking pictures while repeating a mantra of "Here it is. Izuku, what the F?" Izuku thought as he was suddenly surrounded. "Today is the day of my debut," the woman who had knocked out the villain said as she turned over her shoulder. "My name is MT Lady. A pleasure to make your acquaintance." She gave a wink and bent over just a slight amount to flaunt her rear end for the cameras being flashed in her direction. Izuku turned and looked at Izumi, who had finished digging through her bag and brought out her notebook. She had a habit of taking notes about heroes, villains, and quirks in general in those notebooks. She claimed that it was so she could be the best hero she could, but Izuku thought it might just be a way for Izumi to cope with the difficulty and societal stress of being quirkless. Izuku, right along with the superpowers came an explosive increase in crime. When the country was stuck in the slow process of drastic law reforms, courageous people started performing heroic acts, stuff from out of comic books. Guarding against superpowers and defending against evil heroes were soon accepted by the public, and it was established as an official position within the government. Based on their performance, they get paid by the government and gain renown among the masses. A few minutes later, after the police and heroes had handled the scene and began to disperse the civilians, Izuku watched and waited as Izumi made her notes in that notebook. Izuku listened to her mutter to herself about the villain's quirk, as well as analyze MT Lady's quirk. Izuku waited patiently for Izumi to stop taking notes and writing, but it didn't seem like she was going to stop anytime soon. Izumi, no, but whether or not she can control the size, Izumi muttered to herself as she wrote in her notebook. What's that you got there, girl? You taking notes? You want to be a hero? The man who stood beside Izumi looked over and asked. That's great. You can do it. Izumi, yes. I'll do my best. Izumi turned around with a small gasp. No one, besides Izuku, had ever given her any confidence in her ability to become a hero. Izumi smiled brightly at the man while she blushed from slight embarrassment and joy at being told something like that. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A little while later, Aldra Junior High, Mustafu, Japan, with Izuku and Izumi. Izuku and Izumi sat in class as their homeroom teacher spoke. He was talking about choosing future careers. Most of the students let out groans of boredom or sighs as they already knew what they wanted to do. Izumi sat with her head lowered as she continued writing in her notebook. Izuku simply let his head rest against his desk. He used to have no intentions of becoming a hero, but after a certain person found and helped him after his quirk went haywire, Izuku thought about entering into that field. The homeless man who had taken an interest in him insisted that he apply for a hero course. Pausing for a moment to grab the papers in front of him, the teacher threw them in the air and they scattered. Homeroom teacher, you're all pretty much planning to go into the hero course, right? The class shouted in excited agreement. Most students began showing off and using their quirks within the classroom. Some were as simple as having stretchy eyeballs or summoning small ball of water in the palm of their hand. Others were a bit more complex. Izuku looked around at all the kids showing off their quirks until his eyes fell on Izumi. Izumi held her head down as she looked at the others in the class. Izumi was accustomed to this. She just hoped that the teacher wouldn't announce her application to UA homeroom teacher. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks. The teacher spoke, but using your powers at school is against the rules. Katsuki Bakugo, teach? A loud, brash voice called out to the homeroom teacher. The voice cut above the general chatter of the other students. Don't lump us all in the same group. I'm not gonna be stuck at the bottom with the rest of these rejects. Classmates, that was uncalled for, Katsuki. Yeah, what is that supposed to mean? Who do you think you are? Katsuki, you all should shut up like the extras you are. The loud, brash blonde laughed at the classmates who were protesting his description of them. Homeroom teacher, oh, if I remember correctly, you want to go to UA High, right, Bakugo? The teacher looked at the clipboard and spoke. This sent a shock through the classroom. Some students began to mutter amongst themselves. Izuku sent a pointed look at Izumi, who appeared just as shocked when she heard that. Girl 1, UA. That national school. Boy 1, it was in the top 0.2% this year, you know. Boy 2. Their acceptance rate's always really low too. Izuku watched Izumi shrink into herself as their classmates' comments resounded through the room. Each one was a reminder of just how far away her dream truly was. Izuku could only watch and wait for Katsuki to finish his rant while hoping the teacher wouldn't draw attention to him or Izumi with their applications to UA. Katsuki, that's exactly why you guys are just extras. Katsuki shouted as he jumped up onto his desk. I aced the mock test. I'm the only one at this school who could possibly get into UA. I'll definitely surpass All Might and become the top hero. Katsuki gripped his fist and raised it into the air in preemptive triumph. My name will be inscribed on the list of top earners. Homeroom teacher, oh yeah, the Midoriyas wanted to go to UA, too, right? The teacher looked at the clipboard and read off. Izuku groaned inwardly and Izumi shifted uncomfortably in her seat. They had really hoped that their homeroom teacher would just let it go and not say anything. But that wasn't how their teacher worked. The classroom fell into a hushed silence. No one wanted to say anything as they turned to look at the green-haired girl with her head against her desk and the mossy-haired boy who sat staring out the window, uninterested in the conversation at hand. The class burst into loud fits of laughter as they began to mock Izumi and whisper about Izuku. Boy 1, Midoriya. No way. One boy said as he laughed, looking at Izumi, who had lifted her head to look around at the class laughing at her dream. Boy 2, you can't get into the hero course just by studying. Another boy shouted, his laughter barely able to be contained. Boy 3, there's no way they'd let someone who's quirkless in. A third boy couldn't contain his doubt and expressed it with a snarky grin. Izumi, they got rid of that rule? Izumi protested, standing up from her desk. There's just no precedent, Girl 1. Hey, Doesn't Midoriya-kun have a host quirk? Disgusting. A girl with glasses leaned into another student and whispered. Girl 2, I heard that he was the one responsible for that massive attack in Fukushima. Weren't we there for a class trip when it happened? Another girl shook her head and whispered to her seatmate. Izuku, that wasn't my choice, none of it was. Izuku thought to himself as he watched Izumi be blown away from her desk and onto the floor by Bakugo slamming his hand into her desk and causing an explosion with his quirk. The Pomeranian is getting out of hand, Izuku thought with a sigh. Katsuki, hey Deku. Katsuki yelled at Izumi, his palms still smoking from the previous explosion. You're below the rejects. You're quirkless. You think you can even stand in the same ring as me? Izumi, no, wait, Kaken. Izumi said as she scooted away from the angry blonde, who was pressing forward. Izumi's back hit the wall of the classroom as she shuddered and tried to explain herself to her childhood friend and bully. It's not like I'm trying to compete with you or anything. Believe me. Izumi lowered her head and fidgeted with her hands as she continued, it's just that it's been my goal ever since I was little. And well, Izumi paused, trying to find the right phrasing to avoid this becoming worse. I won't know unless I try, Izumi said meekly, as she looked up at the blonde-haired boy who simply stared down at her with pure rage and fury. Katsuki, what do you mean, unless you try? Bakugo asked through gritted teeth, his palms smoking once again as sparks made their appearance. Are you taking the test for fun? What the hell can you do? You're quirkless. Izuku, Katsuki. Izuku called out, his voice making it clear that he wasn't going to allow the blonde boy to continue. Elsewhere in 𝗵𝘃𝗧𝗵 a woman's scream could be heard as she sat on the ground, her quirk active, creating a barrier around her. A man wearing a corner store uniform rushed out of the shop and shouted after a man running away. Clerk, thief, someone. The clerk called after the man as he ran away. The thief had an upper body made mostly of a sludge-like material and he wore a pair of jeans and boots. He ran as fast as he could, trying to increase the distance between him and the shop he had just robbed. A small portion of his body gets caught on a lamppost and splits from the rest of him, causing loose cash to fly off as well. Sludge villain, catch me if you can, the villain shouted as he continued running. Paying very little mind to the civilians and bystanders he was shoving to the side as he ran past. Civilian 1. There's no hero around. A man who was standing on the sidewalk spoke as he watched the villain escape. Civilian 2. Normally someone would come right away, another person commented. Civilian 3. This guy's taking advantage of the chaos from this morning. A man spoke, offering a theory as to why there were no heroes coming yet. There are tons of people around who don't know what to do with their quirks. Civilian 4. There's no end to them, a man sighed, exasperated. What the bystanders were unaware of is a man wearing simple clothing had stepped out of the door of a nearby convenience store. Hearing their conversation, the man looked and saw the quickly disappearing villain. Taking a deep breath, his body expanded and grew into a massive muscular form. The once loose t-shirt now clung tightly to the defined muscles of the man. There is an end, the man said, taking a step forward and causing the bystanders to look his way. Why? He said as he took a few steps forward and flashed a large smile. Because I am here. The villain looked over his shoulder and his eyes widened. He hadn't expected to see him here. Sludge villain, SHT. I need to get away. I need to hide. The sludge villain thought as he looked around quickly for a possible escape route. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. At the end of the school day inside Aldra Junior High. With Izuku Midoriya, Izuku had left the classroom a short while before the final bell to use the restroom. He didn't necessarily need to go, but he just wanted to get out of the classroom as soon as possible. He found himself a bit more irritated by Bakugo and his mindless ravings, and needed to get some air. He had left his things in the classroom and needed to go get them. He figured by now the room should be empty, if not, only Izumi should still be here. As Izuku walked through the hallways approaching the opened door of his homeroom, he could hear it. Bakugo's grating voice was speaking, but what he was saying was outlandish. And he knew exactly who he was saying it to as well. Katsuki, if you want to be a hero so bad, just pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of a building? 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗁 said, his voice cruel and mocking as he walked out of the door. His lackeys by his side snickering at the cruelty 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗁 could display. As he was walking out, he turned over his shoulder and held up a hand, popping explosions in it as he looked at whomever he was talking to with the most intimidating look he could muster. Izuku, 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗁, that was too far. Izuku thought as he looked at the backs of the trio of bullies shrinking down the hallway. Izuku made his way to the room quickly, knowing who the target of those words was. As he looked into the room, he saw Izumi simply standing there, her head hanging down as she tried to fight the tears rolling down her cheeks. Izuku slowly approached and pulled Izumi to him, wrapping his arm around her shoulder and grabbing their things. Izuku pushed Izumi to move, even if she didn't want to. Izuku, come on, Izumi, you have to walk with me, Izuku said quietly, trying to avoid sending Izumi spiraling into herself once again. Eventually, the pair made their way downstairs and into the courtyards on the side of the school. As Izuku and Izumi walked, Izumi muttered quietly to herself about 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗁 and what he had said. Suddenly, Izumi stopped walking as they passed by a koi fountain. Izumi, silently and delicately, reached out and grabbed a destroyed notebook. Izuku recognized it. It was the same notebook Izumi used when she recorded information about quirks. The one labeled Hero Analysis for the Future. Number 13 foot. Izumi, my dreams aren't fish food, you know, Izumi said dejectedly, speaking more to the fish that had been nibbling on the pages of the notebook than anyone else. Izuku watched as Izumi clenched her jaw in an attempt to hold back the tears, once again threatening to spill from the corners of her eyes. He watches as she puts it in her bag and turns, silently, and continues walking forward. Izuku continues his pace and catches up to her side once again, as they continue walking, making their way back home. A while later, somewhere in Mustafu, with Izuku and Izumi, the two green 𝗧𝗃𝗃 were walking side by side as they entered a tunnel. This was their usual path home. It was a bit of a shortcut that Izumi had found when trying to avoid 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗁 and his group of followers. Eventually, it just became their routine path home. Today, however, was different. Izumi, I decided back then, didn't I? Izumi pondered aloud. Izuku, Izuku hummed in response, as he had no clue what she was referring to. Izumi, that's right. Izumi said with a sense of reassurance, I won't worry about what other people think. I have to hold my head up high and plunge forward. Izumi clenched her fist in front of her as she raised her head and began laughing as she marched into the tunnel. Izuku watched her for a moment before following her with a sigh. The one thing he could say about that girl was her unyielding determination to become what she dreamed of. A hero. Izuku eventually caught up with her, as she continued her loud, overly boisterous laugh, stomping down the road. Izuku's ears caught a strange sound, barely audible above Izumi's laughter, but he heard it, nonetheless. A strange, disgusting goopy sound could be heard from behind them, almost as if a thick batter or paste was being moved around and sloshing against itself. The sound seemed to reach Izumi's ears as well, as her laughter immediately halted, and she stopped in her tracks. As Izumi and Izuku turned around, they could see the source of the noise. A large villain, made of sludge-like material, had pushed his way out of the sewer cover toward the entrance of the tunnel. As the sludge began to take a distinctive form, Izuku and Izumi could make out eyes and a nasty smile with dark yellow teeth looking down at them. Towering above the two 14-year-old children with a sense of menace and danger Izumi had yet to experience. Izumi began to shake as she muttered to herself, trying to keep calm, but it was no use. Izumi, a villain? Izumi shouted in surprise, though she tried to contain her voice. Sludge villain. 2 medium-sized invisibility cloaks, and one of them just so happens to be a pretty little girl too. The sludge villain spoke, as he looked at the 2 teenagers in front of him. Izuku, Izumi, run. Izuku shouted, before shoving Izumi farther away from him, in an attempt to get her away. Only to no avail. Like a predator pouncing on its kill, the sludge villain threw himself over Izuku and onto the already unbalanced Izumi, swallowing her in his disgusting quirk and using it to smother her, forcing streams of sludge into her nose and mouth. Izumi's notebook was thrown from her hands as she struggled and squirmed, trying to get away from the villain who was trying to take her hostage. Sludge villain. Don't worry, I'm just going to take over your body, the sludge villain said as he continued to force himself onto Izumi. Calm down. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds, then you might even start to enjoy it. Izuku, F. Izumi. Izuku got to his feet and shouted, looking at the villain in the process of assaulting Izumi. Shiro-kuma. No. Izuku clapped his hands together, forming the seal that called forth the divine dogs from his shadow. Both the white and black wolf jump forth and materialize, before immediately rushing to attack the sludge villain. As both of them attempted to attack the villain and Izumi struggled to release herself from his grip, the villain began to boast. Sludge villain, those types of attacks won't hurt me. I'm fluid, the villain announced. Launching out a limb of sludge to attack Izuku and fling him into the wall nearby, he continued, thanks for your help. You're my hero. Izumi continued to struggle as Izuku tried to get back to his feet. I didn't think that had come into the city. Izumi, my body, Izumi thought as she struggled to get free, to breathe. Her vision was beginning to turn dark as she continued to struggle. Am I dying? She thought as she looked toward her notebook, at a drawing of her costume, right beside another drawing she made for Izuku, his hero costume. Izuku, I can't stand up, and Shiro and Kuma can't do anything to this guy. Izuku thought as he pushed himself up to his feet using the wall, looking at Izumi weakly continuing her struggle against the sludge villain. Plus ultra right. I have him. Izuku grimaced at the thought, but knew there wasn't much other option. The last thing Izumi saw before her vision faded was Izuku shifting his hands, one fist over the other as he began to mouth some words silently. She wasn't sure what he was doing, but he was interrupted by the manhole cover flying off. The last thing she saw was a large shadow emerging from the sewer hole. Izuku and the sludge villain immediately turned their attention to the source of the disruption. A large, lumbering tower of muscle and blonde hair, who had punched off the manhole cover like it was nothing. He finished climbing out of the sewer and set the plastic convenience store bag he was carrying onto the ground. It's all right now, young ones, the large blonde man spoke as he finished climbing out and stood tall above the sewer hole. I am here. Izuku, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Isn't that? Izuku thought as he watched the blonde man easily evade the strike that caught him off guard. The whipping limb smashed into the wall, cracking it and causing small chunks of concrete to come showering down. Dodging below a second strike, the blonde man leaned in and ready to punch. As he brought his fist forward, he said, Texas Smash. Texas Smash. The result of the man's punch was a massive blast of air that rushed forward, directly at the sludge villain. Izuku leaned against the wall but could still feel the blast of air pressure as it ripped past him. It pushed against the sludge villain in such a way that the pressure of the air caused him to explode and release Izumi safely. Parts of his liquidy body flew all over the area as Izuku watched in stunned silence. Izuku, All Might. Izuku thought in awe at the sheer power of the #1 pro hero. That blast of air had been enough to knock him off of his senses. Compounded with slamming into the wall, Izuku fell unconscious. Izumi opened her eyes once again, now that she was free of her captor and was able to breathe. Her vision was still hazy, but with what Izuku had shouted and the silhouette she saw shining against her vision, she knew she had been saved by her favorite hero Izumi. All my Izumi gasped out as she tried to regain her consciousness, only to have it fade once again. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A few minutes later outside of the tunnel, with Izuku, Izumi, and All Might, hey. All Might repeated the same phrase as he lightly tapped both siblings' cheeks, hoping to wake them up faster. Both opened their eyes at about the same time, oddly enough. He abruptly stopped the light slap and raised his hand away, saying, "Oh good." Izuku and Izumi had different reactions upon finally getting a grasp of their surroundings. Izumi, the All Might superfan, immediately got worked up and red in the face as she quickly scooted away from her idol. A person she didn't ever think she'd get to see in person. Izuku, however, merely looked at All Might before nodding and getting up. All Might, I'm glad you're okay, All Might said, looking at the two greenettes. Sorry about getting you too caught up in my villain fighting. All Might continued, apologizing with a raise of his hand. I don't usually make mistakes like this, but today, All Might shrugged before continuing, I was in high spirits on my day off in a new place. Haha. All Might finished with his signature laugh. Izuku looked at Izumi and saw her face growing redder and redder with each passing second. She was completely starstruck and couldn't even focus on what the man was saying. Only being in his presence was enough for her. All Might, but you two were a big help, kids, All Might said, before holding out two 2-liter bottles that had been filled with the sludge villain's body. Thanks to you I captured him safely. Izumi, the number one hero, All Might, Izumi mumbled to herself. He's the real thing, he looks completely different in person. Izumi, you're talking out loud. Izuku reminded the girl quietly. Izumi, oh right? Izumi shouted absent-mindedly as she searched for something nearby, an autograph. Where should I? Izumi's eyes finally settled on the notebook, as she reached out and grabbed it. In that notebook? She opened the notebook to a page and saw, scribbled across both pages, was All Might's signature. He already did. Izumi shouted in excitement. Izuku watched on in second-hand embarrassment as Izumi proceeded to boy furiously and thank All Might for his signature, going so far as to proclaim it to be a future family heirloom. Izuku guessed All might be thinking the same thing he was, as all he could muster was a smile and a thumbs up, saying a curt okay before tapping his sides. All Might, well, I need to take this guy to the police, All Might said as he tapped the bottle settled in the pocket of his cargo. Turning around, All Might waved over his shoulder and said, see you again, on the other side of the screen. Whatever that meant. All Might then began to stretch, and Izumi seemed taken aback. She had so many questions to ask, and so little time to get her answers. But there was one question that was pressing on the forefront of her mind. It just had to be answered. Izumi, wait already? Izumi asked, almost pleadingly. All Might, pros are constantly fighting enemies and time, All Might said as he continued to stretch his legs. Izumi, wait, there are still things I need to ask, Izumi thought desperately as she reached out for the blonde man, who was about to jump away. All Might, well then, All Might said as he readied himself to jump, I'm counting on your continued support. All Might launched himself from where he was, leaving Izuku standing there and waving the dust from his face. He watched as All Might became a speck in the sky before turning back to Izumi to suggest they head home. Izuku, hey Izumi. Let's head home. Izuku paused. Izumi wasn't there, neither was her notebook or backpack. Letting out a sigh, Izuku could only guess what could have happened to her. After standing there for a few moments, trying to decide what to do, he eventually follows in the direction All Might had leapt off to. Welp, now I need to find Izumi. Izuku thought to himself sarcastically as he began jogging in the direction he saw All Might flying. Meanwhile in the air, with Izumi and All Might, let go of me. Your fanaticism is too much. All Might shouted as he attempted to pry the teenage girl off of his leg. The two were soaring above the city, as Izumi clung for dear life to All Might's leg, and the blonde man attempted to pry her grip away. The green-haired girl was surprisingly strong, if All Might had to say. Izumi, if I let go now I'll die. Izumi shouted over the wind rushing past her face. All Might, that's true, All Might said, quickly realizing that if, in fact, the girl did let go, she would undoubtedly die from the fall. Izumi, I have a lot of things I want to ask you directly, Izumi shouted once again, trying to keep her face from becoming too distorted from the wind. All Might, I get it. All Might conceded, so just close your eyes and mouth. Izumi did as she was told, tightly closing her mouth and eyes and burying her face into the fabric of his cargo. All Might reached out a hand and held onto the girl's backpack, giving her just a little bit more security than only her grip on his leg. All Might let out a sigh and began to scan the surroundings for a decent landing spot, where he could also have a bit of privacy. All Might coughed into his hand and could taste the copper taste of BLD pooling in his mouth and dripping down his lips. A constant reminder of both his time limit and his permanent injury. All Might, All Might thought to himself, before deciding on a building to land on. After safely landing, All Might placed 𝗬𝗵𝗲 on the roof. The girl immediately collapsed to her knees and continued shaking. Her hair was an absolute mess from the wind, but that wouldn't stop her. All Might turned around and began walking away. All Might, good grief. If you talk to the people downstairs, All Might said, taking a few steps away from the girl, I'm sure they'll let you down. I seriously am out of time, so I really must go. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, wait. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 shouted, scrambling to her feet to address her hero. All Might, I will not wait. Crime doesn't wait, my girl. All Might once again shot the girl down, continuing to walk away. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, but 𝗬𝗵𝗲 said weakly, reaching out for her last thread of hope. She could hear all of the ridicule, the mocking, and the pity she had received through the years. She remembered the Quirk doctor's words, she remembered 𝗵𝗲𝗄 apologizing profusely, and most of all, she remembered the voices of her classmates and of 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃𝗁𝗃𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃. That may be true, they may be right, but, 𝗬𝗵𝗲 thought, before her words just tumbled from her mouth, can I become a hero like you, even if I don't have a quirk? This question caused All Might to stop walking. He didn't turn, or really say anything at first. He just seemed to stand there and ponder her question. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 began to get nervous about the response she might get. Truly, it terrified her. She managed to continue stuttering out her words. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, can even someone without a quirk be like you? 𝗬𝗵𝗲 asked, her voice filled with both hope and pain. A hesitance due to the fear of rejection that would come with such a question. If All Might answered her question like all the others, she didn't know what she would do. Maybe she would just accept it, like she should have before. All Might froze in place, and slowly looked over his shoulder at the girl behind him. 𝗳𝗵𝗿𝗺𝗺. Shadows, 1/10, divine dogs, 2 wolves, 1 white and 1 black which manifest from the wielder's shadow. Summoned by performing a wolf hand seal, or shadow puppet. Both are capable of tearing humans and animals apart with their fangs and devouring them. Each of the dogs can detect enemies and items and notify their 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃𝗃 when one is close. Their tracking abilities allow them to find lost allies and locations as well. Third-person POV. Somewhere in Mustafu, with 𝗬𝗂𝗧𝗂𝗧 was making his way through the streets, looking for anywhere that the giant billboard of a man and his sister could have gone. He had been mostly unsuccessful in his search, as for some reason, no one ever paid enough attention to their surroundings unless the danger was right in front of them. 𝗬𝗂𝗧𝗃, geez, if only people actually paid attention to SHT going on around them, then maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't need heroes in the first place. 𝗬𝗂𝗧 thought to himself as he continued to walk. Thinking back on it, there was never really a time that 𝗬𝗂𝗧 remembered idolizing heroes. He had always found it strange, the drive for people to do such things. But then he met 𝗬𝗵𝗲, and his outlook on them changed. He had always been looked at sideways for his quirk, beyond being in the minority that had developed their quirk during infancy, for having a host quirk. There were no host quirk heroes either, maybe that was why. No, 𝗬𝗂𝗧 didn't think that could be it, he just never really saw their purpose. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 had been the one to show him why they existed, at least, in theory and spirit she was a quirkless girl, who had always had her odds stacked against her, in a way that was even worse than him. Yet, despite all the difficulties and daily reminders of the impossibility of the task, she stood strong, seeking to embody the very essence of her idol, All Might. That's why he was sure that if 𝗬𝗵𝗲 was with All Might, she wouldn't let him leave without asking the one question she had asked her mother so long ago. The same question she had asked him. On the roof of a building near the Tengen shopping district, with 𝗬𝗵𝗲 and All Might 𝗬𝗵𝗲, even if I don't have a quirk, can I become a hero? 𝗬𝗵𝗲 asked, putting her last lifeline out, hoping that she would finally get even a thread of hope to grab onto. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 clutched her hands in front of her feet and lowered her head, afraid of the response she would get. All Might stopped walking. He had heard something that was both a surprising and a heartbreaking question. One that he, himself, had asked a long time ago. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, can even someone without a quirk be like you? 𝗬𝗵𝗲 asked, her legs shaking as she asked her question. She shut her eyes tight, in both fear and embarrassment. She was afraid to look at his face, Just in case it would be like everyone else, the look of pity and shame they would give her for her dreams. All Might turned over his shoulder to look at the girl. She was brave, but to what extent? All Might knew what he had to say, and he didn't want to. But Toshinori also knew he was running out of time to be All Might. Looking at the girl with messy green hair, he answered, "All Might, without a quirk." All Might said, looking at the girl, who was still shaking in place. He didn't get to continue, as his body was racked with terrible pain. He had used up all of his time, and this form wasn't going to hold out any longer. Struggling to hold himself up, All Might clutched at his 𝗧𝗵𝗲, hoping that he might be able to simply push through. However, the steam leaking off of his skin was definitely not a good sign, and he was doing his best not to slip out of his form. Resting an elbow on his knee and keeling over to minimize the amount of steam pouring off of him, All Might gritted his teeth and held out hope. All Might, oh no, holy goddamn it, not now. All Might thought, grunting in frustration and pain, barely holding himself together. "Izumi, it might have been because I don't have a quirk," Izumi spoke, once again opening her eyes, but keeping them focused on her feet. "But I'm always made fun of." Izumi shifted in place, now rubbing her thumbs over one another in an attempt to calm her nerves. To be speaking about this in front of an adult, and the #1 pro hero no less. Maybe that's why I don't know, but I think saving people is super cool. Izumi found herself able to speak with more confidence, as she hadn't been shut down or laughed at yet. Saving people with a fearless smile. "I want to be the greatest hero, like you." Izumi finished, finally looking up at All Might. In front of Izumi was not the buff, tall man she was expecting, but something closer to an emaciated corpse than a living human. His blonde hair now appeared shaggy and unkempt, with 2 long bangs that framed his skeletal face and accentuated his strong brow, which kept a strange shadow over his teal eyes. Izumi could do nothing but stare in shock and let her jaw hang wide as she began to shout in surprise. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. In an alley in the Tengen shopping district, a 2-liter bottle filled with a strange green liquid and 2 floating balls sits near a trash can, lying on the cold ground in an alley. The balls slowly shift and blink, seeming to get a bearing on its surroundings. Sludge villain, 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃. What happened? The sludge villain, who had been trapped for transport within the empty soda bottles, spoke to himself. It took him a moment to recall what exactly had happened, and when he did, it enraged him. Oh yeah, that BSTRD. If it weren't for that BSTRD. 1. Hey, Katsuki, aren't you and Midoriya childhood friends? One of the boys who commonly followed Bakugo spoke, looking at the spiky blonde hair of the boy in front of him. 2. You went a little overboard today. Another boy, similarly a follower of Bakugo, Katsuki, said. His face contorted into something between a teasing smirk and a curious look. Katsuki, it's her fault for getting in my way, Katsuki said, looking down at his feet. A slight pink rising on his cheeks. Kicking a nearby bottle, which Katsuki thought to be filled with restaurant grease, against a nearby light pole and knocking the lid off, causing some of its contents to be spilled. 2. Don't let it get to you, the boy with long hair said, looking at Bakugo and smirking wider. Bakugo let out a tch and looked away, thinking back on what Izumi had said during class earlier that day. Something about the way she couldn't even directly say that she wanted to be a hero and kept dancing around the subject. He had hoped she would say something, anything. Bakugo, she's still an idiot dreaming like a kid. Katsuki spoke, the venom in his voice audible to the 2 followers. He sparked up his palm and blasted the empty can he was carrying, charring it and leaving it smoky and black. Just watching it me off, Katsuki said, the irritation in his voice growing, as he tossed the can to the side. The 2 followers simply looked at each other in disbelief. Neither of them thought that that was the true reason, judging from the red on his face, but they wouldn't make mention of it so as to not become the target of his aggression. 1. Then, after sighing and looking back at the blonde, the boy offered something to do. Why don't we go to the arcade for a change of pace? You'll come too, right, Katsuki? Katsuki. Bakugo answered, looking back unenthused. 2. Then let's go to the one in front of the station. There's lots of prey there. the boy with long hair said. The green sludge crept closer and closer, unnoticed by the trio of boys within the alley. Quickly passing by the blown-up can lying on the ground, and got near the blonde boy's feet. You're terrible. The boy responded, looking at his friend in amusement. Katsuki, what? If we get caught, it'll end up on my record. Katsuki shouted in protest, not wanting to ruin his chances of getting into UA before even taking the test. It was then that the two boys noticed something creeping up behind Bakugo. A mound of sludge that seemed to grow larger and larger with each passing second. Both boys took an instinctive step away from the explosive blonde and pointed at the strange amalgamation of sludge. 1 and 2, hey look, the boys said, panicked and pointing behind Bakugo. Bakugo turned over his shoulder and looked, finally noticing the sludge villain pulling himself together and growing in size. Beginning to loom over the trio of boys, the sludge villain focuses his eyes on Bakugo and opens his mouth. Sludge villain, an invisibility cloak with a great quirk, the sludge villain said, looking at the blonde-haired boy and preparing to strike. Somewhere near Tetouan Station, with 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had made it to Tetouan Station, and nearby where a majority of buildings and the 𝗵𝘃𝗲 police station were. He figured that if he'd be able to find Izumi anywhere, she'd be around here. Especially since she got taken by All Might, for what he assumed must have been the ride of a lifetime. After a few minutes of diligently searching, Izuku made the decision to use one of the two divine dogs to try and sniff out where Izumi could have gone. While Izuku didn't want to get in trouble for using his quirk, he figured that he could explain it away should anyone become too curious. Clasping his hands together, Izuku called out 𝗵𝗲, the black wolf, and ordered him to sniff out any trace of Izumi. He knew that it would be a bit more difficult, since the last time 𝗵𝗲 would have been able to get a scent from Izumi was when she was covered in the sludge villain's quirk. Unlike what Izuku expected, it only took 𝗵𝗲 a few minutes to be able to pick up the scent. However, 𝗵𝗲 was taking Izuku deeper into the city, closer to the Tetouan shopping district. Continuing to follow 𝗵𝗲, as he had no reason to doubt the nose of his quirk, Izuku felt the ground shake and he could hear a massive explosion rocking the air in the nearby area. Closer to Izuku than he wanted to believe it was. Inside a building in Tengen 𝗵𝘃𝗲, with All Might, Toshinori walked down the steps as he coughed into his hand. He was doing his best to keep the BLD from staining his white t-shirt. He couldn't help but think back on the words he just said to the girl. Flashback, Toshinori, All Might, pros are always risking their lives. I cannot simply say, you can become a hero, even without power. Toshinori continued, his words heavy as he looked away from the girl. He knew what he said must have devastated her, and he couldn't bear to look at her, especially not now. He had explained the dangers of being a hero. He even revealed his injury to her to try and prove his point. He just hoped she would understand. Izumi, I see, Izumi said, her voice trembling as she held back the tears threatening to spill. Her shock was the only thing keeping them held back. Toshinori, All Might, if you want to help others, then you could also become a police officer. Toshi spoke, doing his best to try and offer a different path to the girl in front of him as he stood up. They're often teased and looked down on because they get the villains delivered to their doorstep, but it is also a fine occupation, Toshinori said, his voice calm and soothing, trying to make the painful rejection as easy and painless as he could. Toshinori made his way to the door and opened it. It's not bad to have a dream, Toshinori said, his head falling just a little, but you also have to consider what's realistic. Young ladies. Toshinori didn't look back at the girl as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't know if he would be able to stand the look he knew was on her face. Present, Toshinori. I can't dwell on that. I showed her my injury. If even I can get hurt, then someone without a quirk could get even more injured than this or die. I don't want a girl with a bright future throwing herself at something when she's almost guaranteed to die in the line of duty as a hero. Toshinori thought to himself as he steeled his resolve, knowing that he made the right choice. Now, I need to quickly get this guy. Toshinori spoke but paused, stopping himself as he looked down at his empty pocket, the one which had held the bottle with the captured sludge villain within. Toshinori began to panic. He looked around him after turning his pockets out and finding no trace of the bottle. As he quickly looked around, searching for the missing villain, Toshinori heard a massive boom. An explosion rocked the building slightly as he looked out a nearby window and saw a large amount of smoke rising into the sky. It was then that he realized. Toshinori, don't tell me, Toshinori muttered to himself. On the roof of the same building, with Izumi boom. Izumi was still standing there, lost in her pool of shock and misery. She couldn't believe All Might had said that to her, and without even sparing a glance back as he left. Then, all of a sudden, she was pulled out of her thoughts by the sound of an explosion. The surprise had brought her back to reality as she looked around quickly, trying to find the source of the loud sound. Izumi, a villain? Izumi shouted to herself as she noticed the rising smoke nearby. Turning to begin running toward the stairs to get to street level, Izumi continued, "What hero will be going to the scene?" It was as she was about to reach the door that All Might's words came back to her, nagging at the back of her mind like a cold wind rustling through the bare trees in autumn. She didn't know why she found herself so eager to go. The same words that everyone else had told her. He was much nicer and more polite about it, but nevertheless, it was the same. After all, there was no point. She had just been told that she couldn't be a hero by her idol and the #1 hero, so who was she to argue? Crestfallen, Izumi sighs and continues walking toward the door, shuffling and dragging her feet as she makes her way down the stairs and to ground level. The dream of being a hero has officially been snuffed out. Or has it? SHADOWS, RD person POV near Tuin shopping district. With Toshinori ran as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't want anyone to be seriously hurt, especially since it was due to his negligence that would lead to their situation. Toshinori huffs and puffs as he moves toward the incident, pushing through the crowds to try and get closer, hoping that his gaunt frame would allow him to weave between the amassed civilians who were blocking his way forward. Screams could be heard ringing throughout the entirety of the Teruin shopping district as blasts and explosions continue to ring out. The buildings in the nearby vicinity have gone up in flames and heroes are doing their best to put a stop to both the fires and the massive sludge villain who has taken a hostage. Storefronts collapse and signage fall off of the faces of the buildings. The fire continues to spread as civilians attempt to escape to a safe distance, hoping and praying that a hero would be able to stop this destruction before it got any worse than it currently was. A trio of heroes, 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃, and 2 others rush up and assess the scene. The police have already created a perimeter to prevent any civilians from rushing forward or becoming an additional target for the villain. On a quick scan of the scene, 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 can see a massive amalgamation of sludge that seems to be wrapped around a boy with blonde hair. The flames surrounding the villain make it hard for him to clearly make out the situation, as well as prevent his approach to attempt to save whoever it is the villain had trapped. But for a moment he could see clearly. The hostage was wearing a middle school uniform. 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃, a child was taken hostage? 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 shouted, both enraged and concerned about the new development. Deciding to throw caution to the wind, 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 slammed his fists together and rushed forward, attempting to strike the sludge villain. "You coward!" 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 shouted as he slammed his fist into the gooey body of the sludge villain. 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃's fist sunk into the sludge villain and almost became trapped. 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 had to reach forward and try to claw his arm free as it began to sink into the sludge. 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃, what the hell is this? 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 said through gritted teeth as he struggled to free his arm from the hold the villain had gotten on him. "I can't grab hold." 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃 had made the realization too late and was off guard when the sludge villain used one of his limbs to smack the hero away, throwing him far enough that he didn't have to worry about him reaching the boy he was holding hostage. Hero 1, 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗃, a hero with a bird-like helm and yellow cape shouted as he ran forward, attempting to provide some type of assistance. Hero 2, 𝗬𝗵𝗃, another hero, who was wearing a costume with baseball-themed gear and aesthetics, called out as he dodged an attack from the sludge villain. "Sludge villain, don't come near me," the sludge villain proclaimed, staring at the heroes surrounding him. A loud guttural screaming took his attention from the heroes to his hostage. As the boy had begun to shout and attempt to pry himself free from the sludge villain's tight grasp. "Katsuki, I won't let sewage like this swallow me," Katsuki shouted as he attempted to pry himself free. As he continued to push his body forward in an attempt to pull himself out, 𝗬𝗏 activated his quirk and began to cause large explosions, both damaging the nearby structures more and causing the heroes to back away in an attempt to remain safe. The heroes and nearby civilians had to cover their faces from both the blast and the smoke coming their way. The fires began to spread even more as well, drawing even more attention from the nearby heroes, who were unfit to be able to combat the sludge villain. Sludge villain, what power? The sludge villain complimented Katsuki mockingly. I've hit the jackpot. With this quirk and power, I can get revenge on that guy. The sludge villain thought as he smiled menacingly and looked at the boy in his grasp. Enthused and emboldened by this new line of fantasy, the sludge villain began to change rapidly, growing in size and amount, causing the bystanders to gasp and the heroes on site to take an additional step back. This was beginning to be too much for them to handle. Civilian 1, whoa, what's that? Could he be a big shot villain? A man with long blonde hair kept in a gray beanie asked the people around him. Civilian 2. She's here. The rookie hero 𝗵𝗃 lady. A woman with dark brown hair yells as she looks up and sees the blonde hero rushing forward. The lady rushed forward, only to come to a screeching halt as she realized that she was too big for the area the sludge villain was in. Attempting to fit even one of her feet within the area is too little, so she pulls back and looks down at the heroes who are on the scene. Lady, I need there to be at least 2 lanes. 𝗵𝗃 lady shouted. Her inability to control the size to which she grows became a glaring flaw in this situation. The 2 boys who had been walking with Katsuki came close together as they attempted to back away from the quickly encroaching flames. They had found themselves stuck in a building when they sought shelter after 𝗵𝗃 had been taken hostage by the sludge villain. As the 2 boys whimpered and huddled closer together, they suddenly felt themselves being wrapped by a wooden substance. Quickly being pulled to a nearby hero, 𝗵𝗃, as he moved through the area and rescued people who had been stuck in buildings and trapped by the fires. 𝗵𝗃, I'm not good with explosions. And all of this fire is making it hard for my wood. 𝗵𝗃 shouted as he ran with 4 civilians in tow, wrapped in his wooden appendages. I'll leave it to someone else for today. Backdraft, thanks for that. Backdraft, the firefighter hero shouted in response, I have my hands full fighting the fire. Backdraft had both of his hands and an additional hose nozzle on his shoulder spraying water and extinguishing fires as fast as he could. The fire truck's not here yet? Backdraft shouted over his shoulder as he looked for some sort of assistance nearby. How are things over there? 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃, he's sticky and hard to grab. 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 replied to Backdraft, establishing the situation they found themselves in, and a child with a strong quirk is struggling against him. Hero 2, thanks to that, it's a minefield. The hero dressed in baseball apparel spoke, adding to 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃's explanation of the situation. It's hard to do anything against this triple play, he said, slipping the pun in. Bakugo Katsuki continued to struggle and try and pull free. His mouth had been completely covered, and the only thing 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 could see was the boy's eyes and the top of his head. Gritting his teeth and steeling himself to make a crazy move on the boy's behalf, the sludge villain locked eyes with 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃. The 2 heroes realized as the sludge villain whipped one of his appendages at them, which they barely managed to dodge. Hero 2, CRP. 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃, there's no one who can take care of this at the scene right now. 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 shouted, realizing the disparity between the heroes on the scene and the villain in front of him. Hero 1, all we can do is wait for someone with a more suitable quirk, another hero shouted in response. Backdraft, let's hold back the damage until then. Backdraft shouted, trying to remain heard over an explosion blowing the windows out from the inside of a building nearby. 𝗵𝗃, don't worry, I'm sure someone will be here soon. 𝗵𝗃 shouted as he hung from the side of a nearby building and continued reaching out to survivors who were trapped within the burning buildings. 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃, I feel bad for that kid, but he'll just have to bear it a little longer, 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 thought to himself as he tensed his fists by his sides. If only I had enough power to blow that guy away. Civilian 3, hey, doesn't it look kinda bad? A man near the back of the large crowd spoke. His concern is evident, if not completely unnecessarily obvious. Civilian 4, you can do it, heroes. A woman yelled from within the crowd. Toshinori had just managed to arrive on the scene, and out of breath. He leaned on a nearby lamppost for support as he tried to regain some semblance of strength and sure-footedness. Staring at the crowd in front of him, and beyond to the sludge villain he had managed to let escape. He was taken aback when he saw the destruction in the general area, realizing that it was when he was fighting with the girl with green hair, while he was in the air, that he had lost that bottle. Toshinori, it was back then. Toshinori thought, making the connection. I was too distracted by my DMN time limit. I can't believe I made a mistake like this after admonishing that girl. Toshinori clutched his 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in pain as he looked on, almost helpless to do anything but watch. The situation unfolding in front of him. Pathetic, absolutely pathetic, SHADOWS. Third-person POV, somewhere near Teruin shopping district, with Izumi. Izumi was walking home. She wasn't sure where Izuku was, nor did she really care at the moment. She found herself lost as she looked through her analysis notebook, recalling everything she had been told up until what 𝗷𝗵𝗃 said on the roof. Classmates, she's still dreaming like a kid even though she's in her third year. Teachers, it's time for you to think seriously about your future, young lady. 𝗷𝗵𝗃, Toshinori, it's good to have a dream, but you also have to consider what is realistic. Their words resounded in her mind like the ringing of a church bell. Each voice clawed at her heart and her mind, dragging her dream into the graveyard it stood above. She found herself staring at the page in her notebook which had been autographed by 𝗷𝗵𝗃. Shutting the notebook and letting out a defeated sigh, Izumi continued walking, lost in thought. Izumi, even a top pro said it, Izumi thought to herself as she trudged along, her head hanging and tears stinging the corners of her eyes. Don't cry. You knew, didn't you? All along you knew. The reality, Izumi wiped her eyes as she continued walking, her thoughts spiraling deeper and deeper into a dark reality that she now faced. You knew. That's why you were so desperately trying. You were averting your eyes, not looking at reality. Sorry, Izuku, you were wrong, Izumi thought melancholically. Another explosion took Izumi's attention out of her own self-pity and back onto her surroundings. She had wandered toward the Teruin shopping district, really close to the last explosion. She looked across the street and could see a massive amount of people gathered up in a crowd, looking at something happening in the shopping district. The smell of smoke was strong and the billowing cloud was extremely close now. Izumi, 𝗧𝗵𝗃. Is this where the explosion earlier was? Izumi thought to herself as she looked at the smoke billowing from the tight street. Hang on, does that mean that I came out of habit without noticing? Izumi couldn't stop herself from crossing the street and approaching the crowd, attempting to get a good look at the scene in front of her. Stop it, it'll just feel meaningless right now. Izumi tried to chastise herself as she habitually attempted to stand on her tiptoes to get a better look above people's heads. Izumi saw it, the villain responsible for the attack. It was the sludge villain. Izumi, why is that guy here? Izumi shouted to herself in disbelief. Did he get away from 𝗷𝗵𝗃? Izumi pondered frantically. It was the same sludge villain that had attacked her and Izuku. The one 𝗷𝗵𝗃 had defeated after he had slammed Izuku into the wall. The one 𝗷𝗵𝗃 had put into bottles. The bottles he had put into his pockets. The same that Izumi had grabbed onto, in order to be able to have a conversation with 𝗷𝗵𝗃. Izumi, this is my fault, Izumi muttered to herself. Fear and panic struck her in her core, as she began to blame herself for this situation occurring in the first place. Civilian 1, why aren't the heroes doing anything? A man with short brown hair asked another man in the crowd. Civilian 2, they can't? A man standing nearby answered. Apparently the villain caught a junior high schooler. It's been like this for a while. Izumi, caught? Izumi whispered to herself with a gasp. It's been like this for a while. How? Izumi looked at the scene in front of her, looking at the poor person being held hostage within the sludge villain's grasp. Izumi remembered how awful it was when it was her, and that was only for a few moments, but this person had been there for a while. How can they bear that suffocation? Izumi asked herself, I thought I'd die after just a few seconds. Wow, Civilian 2, anyway, wasn't that villain the one 𝗷𝗵𝗃 was chasing earlier? The man continued. The moment the words "All Might" left the man's lips, word spread like wildfire. People began looking around for the #1 hero, hoping to catch a glimpse of him in action. Mutters began spreading quickly throughout the crowd as people began talking amongst themselves. Completely unaware that Toshinori was present and could hear everything being said. Each sentence was like another weight bearing down on him. It was getting to be unbearable. He could hear people wondering where he was, and what he was doing instead of being there, saving the day like he was supposed to. Toshinori could only lower his head in shame as he heard their whispers. "Izumi, it's my fault. This is my fault." Izumi thought to herself as she covered her mouth to prevent herself from screaming. "He can't do anything. And it's all because of me." Toshinori. Pathetic. Toshinori could only repeat the word in his mind, chastising and criticizing himself for his weakness and foolishness. Izumi, he can't catch that guy. All they can do is wait for a hero with a more suitable quirk. Izumi's thoughts continued to spiral as she watched helplessly. Toshinori. Pathetic. Toshinori clutched at his the scar and the pain still there. He hoped that clutching it tighter would make it stop hurting, make it so that he could buff up and go save the day, but he couldn't. "Izumi, do your best." "I'm sorry." Izumi thought as she shrunk into herself. "I'm so sorry." Toshinori. Pathetic. Izumi, help will arrive soon. Truly will. Toshinori. Pathetic. Izumi, someone a hero will soon. They have. Izumi continued trapping herself in thought, only finding herself ripped out of it when she noticed who was being held captive by the sludge villain. That spiky blonde hair, she would recognize it anywhere. Izumi watched as Bakugo Katsuki continued to struggle, in vain, against the sludge villain and his control. Izumi could see he was struggling to even breathe, and when she saw Katsuki's eyes he was afraid. Bakugo Katsuki was afraid. In a flash, Izumi's body moved on its own, rushing through the crowd and breaking the perimeter established by the police. Toshinori noticed this and gasped in horror. Another nearby figure witnessed this as well and froze in place as he watched horrified at the quickly disappearing green-haired girl. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A few minutes before near Tuhun shopping district, with Izuku had heard the massive explosion relatively close by. Kuma had led him in this direction, but it didn't seem like Izumi was nearby. However, there sure were a lot of people running and screaming as they rushed past him. Izuku was curious and continued to make his way toward the scene. Whether Izuku would admit it or not, he also enjoyed watching the heroes in action, just nowhere near as much as Izumi did. Izuku had a few heroes whom he idolized, mostly ones who stayed out of the spotlight and didn't seek a ton of fame or fortune from their work. Heroes like Eraserhead came to mind for Izuku, the true definition of a hero. In the confusion, Kuma and Izuku ended up separated for a few moments, when Izuku caught sight of what people were running from. A massive monster that looked like it was made out of slime or sludge. It was disgusting but also concerningly familiar. Izuku, what the hell? How did he get free? And what's with the heroes? Aren't they going to do something? Izuku thought as he looked at the scene in front of him. He could see the other end of the street, where there were a few pro-heroes and a semi-large crowd was beginning to gather. Seriously. Izuku began to back away, until he watched the sludge villain cause another large explosion, which forced the heroes to back away. Izuku couldn't tell, but there was someone inside of the sludge villain who was struggling to break free. He could see a few strands of blonde hair, but he couldn't actually see any other features as he was looking from the back. Making the decision to pull Kuma back into his shadow, Izuku quickly moved around the block and made his way to where the people were gathering to spectate the battle. It was as he rounded the corner that he could hear some of the conversations spreading through the crowd. Talks of All Might and his presence, which means that he had to be nearby, and so would Izumi. Izuku rounded the corner just in time to see Izumi. She was standing there with her hands clasped over her mouth and she was staring wide-eyed at the scene. This wasn't a normal reaction for her, so Izuku called out to Izumi, only for his voice to fall on deaf ears. Izuku made his way closer, trying to get Izumi to acknowledge him when he watched her break into a sprint. rushing through the crowd and toward the villain attack. "Izuku, F. Izumi." Izuku called out, but to no avail, as more voices drowned his own out in the chaos. Izuku rushed toward the crowd, hoping to get to her in time, only to watch as she completely breached the perimeter set up by the heroes and police, bypassing both parties and rushing toward the sludge villain with all of the might she could muster in her legs. "Death-Arms, idiot! Stop!" Death-Arms shouted at the green-haired girl who sprinted past him. "Stop!" He shouted again, but the girl paid him no mind as she continued her reckless advance. "Sludge villain. That brat," the sludge villain said aloud, looking at Izumi who had rushed through the crowd and was rapidly approaching him. 𝗳𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 groaned as he could see with his one uncovered eye the freckled face of the girl he commonly bullied, as she rushed forward to try and rescue him. "Izumi, why? Why did I run out? What am I doing?" Izumi thought in a panic as she tried to get her feet to stop moving. As she pleaded for her legs to stop taking her forward, toward the danger she had only narrowly escaped the time prior. "Why? Sludge villain, die in an explosion," the sludge villain shouted as he reached forward with a hand. Sparks of Katsuki's quirk could be seen in the goopy palm as the sludge villain was forcefully activating Katsuki's quirk. "Izuku, F. Izumi. What are you doing? Why are you running toward him still?" Izuku shouted mentally, wishing he could rush through to try and stop her, but she was already out of his reach. "Izumi, what do I do? What can I do at a time like this?" Izumi thought as she frantically continued to run forward. Wait. Page 25. Izumi quickly recalled her analysis of Kamui Woods and the way he used his quirk from a distance to put his enemies off balance before striking. Izumi quickly shrugged off her backpack and grabbed it by one of the straps before it could fall all the way off. Spinning around herself as she continued to move forward, Izumi used the momentum to add extra acceleration to her throw as she launched her backpack flying at the sludge villain in a moment of improvised genius. "Izumi, take that!" Izumi shouted as she watched the bag fly and smacked the sludge villain in one of the few weak points he had. His eye. One of the many items Izumi kept within her bag had managed to slip out and rupture one of the sludge villain's eyeballs, causing him to rear back in pain. This attack gave Katsuki a brief moment of respite, as he managed to free his head from the sludge villain's grasp. Coughing out small particles of green slime, he managed to breathe for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Izumi continued her careless charge as she reached the sludge villain and began to try and claw Katsuki from the disgusting slime he had been caught in. "Izumi, Kaken?" Izumi shouted as she dug her nails into the goopy sludge and pulled. She was moving as fast as her body possibly could, as she could hear her heartbeat in her ears and feel the adrenaline rushing through her system. "Katsuki, why are you here?" Katsuki asked, irritated as he watched Izumi helplessly claw at the viscous sludge surrounding his body. She was desperately trying to free him, but something about that made him mad. "Izumi, my legs moved on their own. I don't know why though." Izumi shouted in response. Her answer took Katsuki by surprise. Izumi, what are you doing?" Izuku thought to himself, concerned, scared, but most of all, exasperated. Izumi, however, was lost. She knew why she did it. She knew why her legs moved. As she heard all of the people who had ever spoken down to her or stepped on her dream, she also heard the voices of Izuku and her mother. Her own promises to do her best and become a hero. Izumi, but in that moment, Izumi thought as she looked at Katsuki with tears in her eyes and a panicked smile on her face. "You looked like you were asking for help," Izumi said, locking eyes with the blonde boy, not caring whether or not he would be angry. Izumi's voice could be heard by everyone around, including Izuku and Toshinori. The two people were standing at the back of the crowd and watching the scene unfold heard her words and felt a tug within their sistich. Toshinori felt something within him light up, once again. And Izuku watched with a mixed sense of dread and pride at the words his sister spoke. She had awakened something within the two men watching. "Katsuki, stop it?" Katsuki groaned as he struggled once again against the sludge villain. A renewed vigor filled him once he heard Izumi say those things to him. Izuku looked to the side for a moment and noticed a strange blonde-haired man, wearing fairly familiar clothes. He was standing, more so leaning against a light pole, and began to straighten out. His emaciated form began to fill out as he began to grow in height as well. The muscles and sudden increase in strength caused the light pole to dent with the man's grip strength. Toshinori, pathetic, Toshinori thought as he began to shift into his buff form, not noticing that he was being watched closely. Pathetic. All Might stood up and let go of the dented light pole. Sludge villain. Just a little longer, the sludge villain muttered under his breath. Don't get in my way, he shouted, 𝗬𝗵𝗃 appendage at the greenette standing in front of him. 𝗳𝗲𝗵𝗃, she'll die in vain. Is she suicidal? 𝗳𝗲𝗵𝗃 shouted as he and the other heroes rushed forward to try and at least save the girl with a death wish. In a flash, it all happened. The heroes were rushing forward, hoping to prevent another needless death. The sludge villain brought his appendage down, intending to crush the girl who had tried to free his hostage. Izuku clapped his hands together and summoned both Shiro and Kuma, who rushed out of his shadow and began pushing through the crowd. All Might suddenly disappeared from where he was standing, leaving a small crater in the sidewalk that left cracks spreading throughout the pavement. Everyone waited, holding their breath for the dust to clear. Most expected the poor girl to have died, crushed under one of those disgusting limbs of slime. Izuku froze in place, halfway through the crowd of people, and like him, Shiro and Kuma also froze where they were, unwilling to move an inch until Izuku willed them to. As the dust was settling, a voice could be heard. All Might, I really am pathetic. All Might spoke as he stood in front of Izumi, holding the appendage the sludge villain was going to use to kill the girl. The same steam poured off his body that denotated his limited time in the All Might form. Izumi, All Might, Izumi stammered, her voice shaky as she sat on her knees on the ground, surprised to still be alive. All Might, even though I admonished you, All Might said, looking at Izumi as he held the large arm-like appendage back, I wasn't putting what I said into practice. All Might ripped his arm away, flinging the appendage back and ripping himself free of the stray strands of sludge that had attached themselves to him. He then quickly grabbed hold of Katuki's arms and held on tight. All Might, pros are always risking their lives. All Might shouted as he spit out BLD violently and readied a massive strike. Katsuki could only watch as the #1 hero swooped in to save him, and the useless Deku who had risked her life to save him stood right there. Bakugo's cheeks once again began to flush, but he wouldn't accept either reason if someone told him they saw him blushing. Sludge villain, All Mights. The sludge villain roared as he made a last-ditch attempt to attack the #1. Quickly forming another arm-like appendage, and 𝗬𝗵𝗃𝗁 it down. All Might, Detroit Smash. All Might yelled as he moved his fist forward, not making contact with the sludge, but rather only the air around it. Detroit Smash, air pressure blasted down the road, pushing the sludge villain off and forcing his body to be pulled away from Bakugo Katsuki's. The massive amount of air pressure caused the sludge villain's body to blast apart, as it could not withstand the massive amount of air pressure being created by the punch. A cyclone of winds quickly dispersed some of the nearby fires as well, causing the flames to dissipate and extinguish. The pros had managed to gather and protect the bystanders from the massive shockwave that followed as a result of All Might's attack. Empty Lady had positioned her hands and arms as a type of windbreak, which a majority of those still at the scene took cover behind. They still struggled to remain upright and hold their ground, but it was nowhere as catastrophic as it could have been. All Might kneeled on one knee as he held the 2 junior high students with one hand. Steam began pouring off of his skin at an even more alarming rate. The sky began to darken overhead as clouds began to move in. The sky opened up and rain began to pour. The punch from All Might had been so strong that it had managed to change the weather itself. The civilians and heroes stood in shock as they watched the form of All Might remain kneeled, his ET rising and falling rapidly with his breath. As the first raindrops fell, people in the crowd began to notice. Civilian 5, Rain, a man with an instrument strapped over his shoulder asked. Civilian 6, don't tell me it's from the wind pressure just now. Another person, a woman, chimed in. Civilian 3, An updraft developed, and another man trailed off. Izuku, holy he, so this is the power of All Might. Izuku thought, taking advantage of the attention being on All Might to recall Shiro and Kuma to his shadow before anyone asked too many questions. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃. He made 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃 spoke, his voice almost reverent. Clouds? All Might stood up after setting Katsuki and Izumi onto the ground safely. Unconscious, but safe. As All Might stood tall, people began to cheer and applaud the man for his act of heroism, calling out and noting that he was able to change the weather with only a fist. All Might stood in the center of the heavily damaged and destroyed area. Struggling to keep himself standing, and almost stumbling back, All Might raises his left hand, putting a fist up toward the sky in a pose of strength and victory. Cheers surround him as people clap and call out in praise. All Might turned over his shoulder to look at the crowd with his signature smile for all to see. However, his eyes were focused on the unconscious form of a green-haired girl. A few minutes later, the heroes and police had spent a short while cleaning and collecting all of the pieces of the sludge villain and getting them stored away in a police van for transport to 𝗳𝗏𝗃𝗏 prison. All Might stood nearby, speaking to cameras as the press and other fans wanted to speak with the hero while they had the opportunity. Izumi sat, being chastised by the heroes for interjecting herself, unwilling to make eye contact with the heroes standing in front of her. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃. Geez, there's a limit to how rash you can be. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃 scolded the girl, his frustration evident on his face, and even more so in his tone of voice. There was absolutely no reason for you to put yourself in danger. 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗏 stood in front of the green-haired girl, repeating everything 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃 had said to her in his own way. While only a few feet away, sat the blonde-haired boy who had been held hostage and saved by All Might. Bakugo Katsuki was also surrounded by heroes, but unlike Izumi, they were commending him on his bravery and his strength, proclaiming that he could easily be a hero with a quirk like his. He knew Diamond well he didn't need some extras to tell it to him. There was a small press crew nearby too, they were filming him and talking in front of their cameras. However, Katsuki didn't care and wasn't paying them any attention. He simply glared at Izumi, bitterness clear in his expression. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A short while later in a neighborhood in Mustafu, with Izumi and Izuku. After Izumi's scolding from the pro-heroes, she got a pretty nasty one from Izuku. Nowhere near as degrading as the one from the pros felt, but it still didn't feel good. He had just finished and Izumi had tried to apologize to him, however, for the moment it seemed he didn't want to hear it. Instead, Izuku simply shook his head and looked forward, but kept his pace matched with hers. Izumi let her head hang once again as she drifted off into her thoughts. She continued trudging along as she began to wallow in what she wanted to do but couldn't. Izumi, I wanted to apologize to All Might, but he was still getting interviewed, Izumi thought as she continued to walk. She had once again retreated to the cage of her mind, and had stopped paying attention to her surroundings. I'll try sending him a message on his website when I get home. Izumi was taken out of her thoughts when she heard a familiar voice, that wasn't Izuku, calling out to her. But he wasn't using her name. Katsuki, Deku? Katsuki called out as he ran closer, trying to get the girl to stop. Whether 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's parasite brother would stop or not, he didn't care. He just wanted to talk to Izumi. Izumi and Izuku stopped walking. Izumi let out a light gasp before turning around, and Izuku looked over his shoulder. Both of them saw the blonde boy running toward them while breathing heavily. Izuku could see a vein popping on his forehead and figured he would just start screaming at them again. But when Katsuki came to a stop, he just caught his breath and looked at the Izumi for a moment, completely ignoring Izuku's existence. But then it started. Katsuki, I never asked you for help. Katsuki yelled as he lowered his head and balled his fists. Izuku, his anger was still there, he just needed a moment for it to surface. He really is like AF Pomeranian, Izuku thought, staring at the boy who Izumi had risked her life to try and save. Katsuki, and you didn't help me? Bakugo continued. As he got more and more frustrated, the more he made a growling noise while yelling. Got it? Katsuki asked, looking at Izumi with rage burning in his eyes. I was fine by myself. Izuku, oh boy, he also growls. What is he? A dog. Izuku thought, trying not to laugh. Katsuki, you're just a quirkless failure playing without a full deck. Don't think you can look down on me. Katsuki seethed, continuing to stare daggers at Izumi. Are you trying to make me owe you or something? Don't you dare look down on me. And just as quickly as he arrived, Katsuki spun on his heel and began marching away. As he began to walk away, he called over his shoulder one last time. Katsuki, you demon nerd. Katsuki didn't look back, and it was a good thing too. Izuku couldn't keep a straight face at the way he was stomping away like a toddler, and Izumi was just barely managing to hold it together on her own. Izumi. Toughness, Izumi muttered. It's like Kaken said, it's not like I accomplished anything, or even changed anything. Izumi thought to herself, watching the blonde boy stomp away in a ridiculous manner. But I'm glad. Izumi thought, letting her head hang once again, now I can think of a realistic future, Izumi muttered. Izuku, a realistic future? What does that mean? Izuku thought as he watched Izumi turn around and begin walking. All Might, I am here. All Might shouted as he zipped out of an alleyway. Izumi, All Might? Izumi stammered, surprised to see the hero once again. Why are you here? Izuku, oh, it's All Might. Izuku said, unenthused. Weren't you surrounded by reporters until just now, All Might? Ha! All Might laughed heartily. Getting away from them was a piece of cake. All Might gave a small two-finger salute to the two greenettes. But because I am All Mig-, All Might was cut off when he burst out of his muscle form and back to his emaciated self. Spitting out an unhealthy amount of BLD, Izumi let out a scream of surprise, and Izuku just raised his eyebrows. He had seen the emaciated man turn into All Might back at the sludge villain incident a little while ago, so seeing All Might turn into the skeleton of a man was just a confirmation. Toshinori, young man, I have to ask that you keep this to yourself, Toshinori spoke, addressing Izuku before looking back at Izumi. And you young lady, I come with thanks, a correction, and a suggestion. Izuku, sure, I saw you transform back at the Tetuan shopping district, so this isn't too surprising. I'm gonna go home. If you want to talk to Izumi, go ahead. I have a feeling there's stuff you want to talk about and I don't want to hear it. Izuku said, continuing to walk towards his home, waving over his shoulder at Izumi as he walked away. See you at home, Izumi. Izuku called out over his shoulder as he continued to walk away. Toshinori and Izumi watched Izuku walk away until his back had disappeared from view. Toshinori turned to Izumi with a confused expression, and Izumi simply sighed and looked at All Might. Izumi, what do you mean, All Might? Izumi asked, bringing Toshinori's focus back onto what he was saying before Izuku nonchalantly dismissed the fact he had interacted with the #1 hero twice in one day. Toshinori, if you hadn't been there, Toshinori spoke, his voice deep and resounding. If you hadn't told me about your life, I would have just turned into a guy in a bodysuit who was all talk. So, thank you. Toshinori bowed his head in thanks to the girl. Izumi, that can't be, it was my fault in the first place. Izumi responded. She felt unworthy of such praise, especially after causing the incident because of her own selfish foolishness. I got in the way of your work, and I said all those impertinent things, even though I'm quirkless. Izumi lowered her head in shame, afraid to meet the man's eyes. Toshinori, that's right. Toshinori said simply. It was because it was none other than the timid, quirkless you at the scene that I was able to act. Toshiner's words hit the girl deep in her heart, and he could tell as she turned to look him in the eyes once again. Top heroes have stories about them from their school days. Most of their stories have one thing in common, Toshinori continued, watching Izumi's eyes widen as he continued to speak. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. The gleam that had died just a short while earlier had returned to Izumi's eyes. The man in front of her, All Might himself, was saying such things. And they were directed at her, about her. Izumi could feel tears threatening to spill as she tried to hold them back. Izumi could hear her mother's desperate cries and apologies. The words she said over and over when Izumi had learned she didn't have a quirk. Inko, in Izumi's mind, I'm sorry, Izumi. I'm so sorry. Izumi's hands clasped at her 𝗧𝗃 as she struggled to maintain her composure. The tears welled up in her eyes as she bent over at the waist, trying to contain herself, to prevent herself from breaking down in front of All Might. Toshinori, that was true for you too, wasn't it? Toshinori asked with a slight smile, as he looked at the girl standing in front of him. The girl was barely holding it together, as Toshinori saw droplets of water fall from the tip of her nose to the ground below. Izumi, yef, Izumi managed to choke out, through her gritted teeth and with her eyes squeezed shut. The tears continued to flow freely as Izumi collapsed to her knees and sobbed. Finally, after so long. Someone, besides Izuku, was telling her this. It felt good to hear it from Izuku, but to hear it from someone else, someone like All Might, was a completely different situation altogether. The words felt like they held so much weight. It almost felt as if she were being both crushed by the weight of the words, but having a pain and pressure relieved from somewhere deep within her. She got to hear the words she wanted to hear for such a long time. Toshinori, you can become a hero. Izumi could do nothing but sob as she stared at the ground below her. There was validation in her dream. Midoriya Izumi could be a hero. SHADOWS. Shadows, 1/10, divine dogs. 2 wolves, 1 white and 1 black, which manifest from the wielder's shadow. Summoned by performing a wolf hand seal, or shadow puppet. Both are capable of tearing humans and animals apart with their fangs and devouring them. Each of the dogs can detect enemies and items and notify their 𝗵𝗃𝗃 when one is close. Their tracking abilities allow them to find lost allies and locations as well. Third-person POV. Inside the Midoriya household. With Izuku had gotten home about an hour ago, after leaving Izumi to speak with the emaciated version of All Might. Whatever they needed to talk about wasn't any of his business. As such, he made his way back home. On his way home, Izuku began to think about training and other such requirements that would be necessary to prepare him for the UE entrance exams in just over 10 months. He had 10 months to get himself into shape, or to figure out his quirk even more. He remembered his quirk was something called 10 Shadows, but at the moment he only had 2 or 3, technically. While he knew that Shiro and Kuma were effective in what they did, the experience against the sludge villain earlier had shown him just how little the 2 divine dogs could do. Izuku made his way to his room. There was something he wanted to check, and it was still there. The book he was given by his paternal grandfather just before his mother passed away. He had never opened it as it was old and dusty, and the old man told him not to open it until he wanted to learn about the true depths of his quirk. He had originally intended to read it after the incident in Fukushima just over a year ago, but the conversations he had with the hero who saved him from his own quirk that day had made him feel uncertain about attempting to advance any further with his quirk. Especially if all of them were as hostile and insane as the big one. Izuku, I know I need to get better, I have to get stronger. If I can't get stronger, then there's no way that I'll ever be able to prevent something like that happening again. And next time, it might be even worse than before. I was lucky that nobody ended up dead because of that, and I think that if any other hero had come, we all would have died. Izuku thought to himself as he sat on his desk chair with the book in hand. I have to at least try if nothing else. Stealing his resolve and opening the cover of the hardback-bound book. He could feel the delicacy of the text sitting on his desk, as merely opening the front cover caused the spine of the book to creak and with stress. The binding seemed to threaten to bust at any wrong movement. Its age-stained pages were brittle and ready to tear if he was too rough with it. Within the front cover, the title was written just above the name of the author. Inside the shadows, the 10 Shadows technique Fushiguro Megumi under the title and name of the author was a symbol that caught Izuku's eye. It was a wheel, specifically a wheel with 8 handles, the same that hovered above the head of that thing. Immediately Izuku turned his attention back to the name of the author. Izuku, Fushiguro Megumi. Isn't Aji-san's last name Fushiguro? Does that mean that I'm related to the person who wrote this? Izuku thought as he looked at the book with a new sense of curiosity. From what I remember, quirks are commonly passed through DNA, and people can't have the same quirk unless they are in the same family, but this book looks at least 200 years old. It doesn't even have a date of publication. So why is the name of my quirk the title of this book? What the hell? Izuku decided to continue reading, turning to the first page, only to find its contents were written by hand. Taking a moment to close the book and actually look at it, it was starting to look more like a journal or diary than a book. Izuku, wait, is this a journal? Why would Aji-san give me someone's journal? Should I? I'll just read the first page. Izuku thought to himself, trying to determine his course forward. While still confused, Izuku opened the journal and began to read. Quickly finding himself taking in the words written on the page and internalizing them. Izuku wasn't sure why, but the way the journal described these things called Shikigami was strikingly familiar to how his own quirk worked. But this didn't say anything about quirks or meta abilities, as they were called during the dawn of quirks in the early 2020s. Instead, it spoke about something called cursed energy and sorcerers. It almost made Izuku laugh. This was ridiculous. It seemed like some fantasy novel or some sort of power from a video game. But the scarily accurate description of Shiro and Kuma, or as the book called them, divine dogs, kept him soberly engaged in his reading. It took him a short while to finish what could be called the foreword, after which, Izuku needed to take a moment to breathe. There was a lot of strange new information being presented to him, stuff that seemed like it came out of a manga, but it was ever so real. He needed time to process all of it before he dared venture deeper into his research. He realized that there was no way that this book could be fake or something of the sort. The handwriting was clearly on the pages of that book, and its age seemed so authentic. Beyond that, was how accurately it was able to describe his quirk. From its activation requirement to some of its downsides. The book even made mention of that thing, which is what truly sold him on its authenticity. As far as he knew, there had never been any reports of that sort of thing before, and he had searched thoroughly. The feeling of understanding this book provided him was a relief, to say the least. It felt like he had at least some answers, as every time he attempted to go to a quirk therapist, they only ever tried to have him focus on the divine dogs. Even though he had brought up that thing, the only thing they wanted to focus on was Shiro and Kuma. It had always been infuriating. Deciding that now would be an ideal time to take a shower and get relaxed, before Izumi or his aunt Inko returned and saw him in such a stressed state. Izuku shut the book and stepped out of his room, making his way to the bathroom. Wondering only now what Izumi and All Might could be talking about. SHADOWS. Third-person POV, somewhere in Mustafu, Japan, with Izumi and Toshinori. Izumi stared up at Toshinori in confusion. He had just said something she didn't expect or understand. In order to ensure that she had, indeed, heard right, Izumi repeated what All Might had told her. Izumi, inherit your power. Izumi asked, confusion evident in her tone. Toshinori, what's with that face? Toshinori asked after he wiped his eyes and gathered his breath from his laughter at the girl's shocked and confused expression. It's just a suggestion. The real show starts after this. Toshinori continued as he took a few steps closer to the girl, who was still kneeling on the floor. Listen, young lady. Toshinori said, pointing up at the sky before quickly pointing at Izumi, you need to decide whether or not you will accept my power. BLD spilled from Toshinori's mouth as he got excited and raised his voice. The injury seemed to affect even his daily life, and Izumi could only look on in both confusion and shock. Izumi, what is All Might even saying? Izumi thought as she continued to look at the man standing in front of her. Toshinori, I'm talking about my power, young lady. Toshinori spoke up once again, wiping the BLD from his lower lip with the back of his forearm. The tabloids called it superhuman strength or a boost, and I constantly dodged the question during interviews with a funny joke. Toshinori's voice grew heavier as he continued speaking, because the symbol of peace, All Might, had to be a natural-born hero. But young lady, I will tell you the truth. Toshinori took a moment to pause and look at the greenette, who remained on her knees in front of him. Raising his hands to his sides, Toshinori continued, my quirk was passed on to me like a sacred torch. Izumi, it was passed on to you? Izumi asked, her voice incredulous as she didn't want to believe the new information. Toshinori, that's right. And next, it is your turn. Toshinori spoke. His voice carried a weight of responsibility. But with that weight of responsibility, Izumi could see the glimmer of hope. The silver lining, a newfound sense of life and purpose had filled the girl's mind and spirit, truly igniting the dwindling flame of her passion and dream. But there were still things that Izumi wanted, she needed to know. Izumi, wait a minute. Izumi spoke up, her voice still shaky as she questioned what the blonde man had said. It's true that your quirk is something hotly debated and is one of the world's greatest mysteries. So much so that not a day goes by when I don't see someone talking about it online. But, well, Izumi's voice began to drop in volume as she began to mutter to herself. I don't really understand what you mean by passing on a quirk. I've never heard of anything like that before, and it's never even been conjectured in the debate. Why is that? Izumi had fallen into her own rabbit hole and was now on a path that seemingly had no end as she continued to mutter to herself. Is it because since the dawn of history, a quirk like that was never confirmed? In the first place it's Toshinori, you always start with denial. Toshinori remarked, going unheard by the green-haired girl. Nonsense? Izumi, Izumi began before she was once again interrupted by Toshinori. Toshinori, I may hide a lot of things, but I don't lie. Toshinori exclaimed before he began to explain in further detail to the girl, the power to transfer power that is the quirk I inherited. Toshinori held his hand in front of him as a bright light seemed to glow for both Izumi and Toshinori. I was crowned with one for all. Izumi, one for all, Izumi repeated, almost in a trance as she stared at the light shining brightly in All Might's palm. Toshinori, that's right, Toshinori said. One person cultivates the power and passes it on to another who also cultivates it and passes it on. It is the crystallization of power that spins together the voices of those who need help, with a courageous heart. Toshinori closed his fist as he looked at Izumi, a fire burning in his teal eyes as they looked into her watery emerald eyes. Izumi, why are you? Izumi stammered, why are you giving me something so great? Toshinori, I have been looking for a successor. Toshinori explained, and then, I thought it would be right for you to inherit it. You, who is just a quirkless hero fangirl, but you were more heroic than anyone else back there. Toshinori's words hit hard in Izumi's tea. It felt as if she had been stabbed, but it didn't hurt. It made her eyes well up with tears, only not from pain or hurt, but from hope. Toshinori, never mind, Toshinori said, rubbing the back of his head. Well, it's up to you though. Toshinori paused before looking at the girl again. Well, what'll you do? Toshinori asked. Izumi, he said so much to encourage me, Izumi thought to herself as she clutched her fist on her uniform skirt, and even told me his secret is there. Izumi leaned her head back and wiped her eyes. Of course there isn't any reason for me to turn him down. Izumi got back to her feet before looking at All Might's emaciated form, her eyes burning with a newfound passion and drive that had been diminishing slowly over the years. I'll do it, Izumi responded confidently, nodding her head and looking into the teal eyes that were covered in shadow. Toshinori, an immediate reply. That's what I thought you'd say. Toshinori said, chuckling slightly to himself as he looked at the determination in Izumi's eyes. But no, it is no easy task to receive this power, Toshinori warned, as the girl only nodded once again, the determination never leaving her eyes. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A few days later somewhere in Mustafu, with Izuku had spent the past couple of days in a confused funk. His mood had dropped since he had opened and begun reading that book. It had contained a lot of information about both his quirk and information about his family, or at least his ancestry. Izuku had never been close with his father's side of the family, as he had never really known his father. There were a few times that Izuku can remember encountering his paternal relatives, and each time they were never the most pleasant memories. He remembers being looked at with scorn by a few of his relatives when they had come to his mother's funeral to pay their respects. It was here that Izuku received the book from his grandfather, Junichi Fushiguro, the only member of his father's family who had ever attempted to be present in his life. Izuku could still remember the words of his grandfather, attempting to console him in the best way he knew how. However, after he moved to Mustafu to live with Inko, that entire side of his family fell silent. In the days since their interaction with 𝗲𝗵𝗃, Izuku had gone to the public library every day after school. Now that Izumi was off doing whatever she needed to do and had insisted that he do the same for himself, Izuku took the opportunity to do a little additional research on both his quirk, if possible, but more importantly on the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 name. It didn't take long to learn that the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 family had, at one time, been fairly wealthy and influential. Specifically around the time of the dawn of Quirks, the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 family had been extremely important figures in the realm of quirk research. Through some additional research, Izuku discovered that the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 family's research had been mostly funded by some defunct university called the Jujutsu Techniques Institute in Tokyo. Although this information was over 270 years old, he could still find some of the news articles related to their discoveries and breakthroughs. Even as recently as 70 years ago, the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 family had a member who had received the Nobel Peace Prize in the field of quirk studies for her research into something known as quirk essence. The study had been one of the major antitheses to the quirk singularity theory and was still quoted, even to this day, as a major debunking point in debates across the world. All of this research only led him to believe more and more of what was written in the book that was given to him. Even his great-aunt's research on quirk essence was described in practically the exact same manner within the book, although it was what the book called cursed energy. Izuku lost his sense of time as he delved deeper and deeper into the history of both his family and the world as a whole. Things like this he had never expected to learn of, much less be the direct descendant of. Izuku had decided today he would research the author of the book he possessed. One 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 Megumi. However, despite his best efforts, nearly nothing could be found. Izuku had only managed to find one thing that mentioned that name, and it was a newspaper article from the year 2018. Something about a terrorist attack in Shinjuku, where 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 Megumi was named as one of the few survivors. Apparently, some speculations said that it wasn't a terrorist attack, but a massive-scale battle, akin to an actual war. However, that just ended up being some manga story made by a guy named Itadori in the 2030s, and that shaped some of the stories surrounding the situation. After all of his efforts, Izuku didn't know where to start. But he now did have some sort of solid lead, the Tokyo Jujutsu Technical Institute. He had looked it up, and the campus, while not open to accepting students, is still kept as a Shinto shrine, with access to a massive library. He figured he might be able to find some sort of record there. If not, it would be a nice place to train. He only had 10 months until the entrance exam, and he wanted to pass at this point, if not only to rub it in Katsuki's face. From what he read, the rest of the campus was still private property that was held by someone, so he should be able to remain undisturbed as long as he went far enough away from the shrine. At the same time, 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 Municipal Beach Park, with Izumi and 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗃 Izumi had just set down another large piece of trash. She had moved a rather large car door, which was very heavy. Over her shoulder, she could hear 𝗲𝗵𝗃 continuing to provide encouraging words and motivational shouts. Izumi picked her pace up, from a walk to a jog, in order to get back to the pile and grab another piece of rusted metal. Izumi breathed hard as she pushed her body to its limit and beyond. It was her 4th day at the 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 Municipal Beach Park, and also the 4th day of her training. She had met 𝗲𝗵𝗃 early that morning as there was no school that day, and started cleaning the beach early. Thinking back on it, Izumi really hoped that 𝗲𝗵𝗃 knew what he was doing. 𝗲𝗵𝗃 had contacted her and told her to meet him here a few days ago. Flashback, days after the sludge villain incident 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗃 Municipal Beach Park. With Izumi and 𝗲𝗵𝗃, Izumi struggled and strained against the ropes she had slipped over her shoulders. She was attempting to move a large, industrial fridge which was heavy on its own, but 𝗲𝗵𝗃 was sitting on top of it. As she struggled against the difficulty of the sand not supporting her feet evenly and the pain of the ropes cutting into her shoulders, 𝗲𝗵𝗃 would call out to her, attempting to push her harder. 𝗲𝗵𝗃, this is such a comfy fridge to sit on. 𝗲𝗵𝗃 called out as he squatted atop the fridge. Izumi was struggling to move across the sandy beach. Izumi continued grunting as she strained to move even an inch forward. only to have the sand give way under her feet and cause her to fall face-first onto the beach. Gasping for air after spending so much effort to move the fridge, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 could barely turn her head to the side, as she felt like she was dying. All Might, if you could move it even a little, it would be easier, All Might said, looking at 𝗬𝗍𝗵's collapsed form on the sandy beach. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, well yeth 𝗬𝗍𝗵 groaned as she forced her arms under her body and pushed herself off of the ground. I mean, you weigh 274 kilograms, right? All Might, no, All Might responded, sounding almost insulted, I lost weight. So I'm only 255 kilograms now, in this form at least. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 could only sigh in response. She didn't want to say anything that might cause this opportunity to be snatched away from her, even if it meant doing something like this. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 looked around at her surroundings before turning back to the large, muscular blonde man. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, anyway, why am I dragging trash at the beach park? 𝗬𝗍𝗵 asked, gesturing to the mountainous piles of garbage and refuse that had gathered on the sandy beach. All Might, ha! All Might laughed before pulling out his phone and snapping a few pictures. All Might then continued, it's 'cause, you know, you're not a proper vessel. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, ha! 𝗬𝗍𝗵 asked, tears welling up in her eyes, what you're saying now is the opposite of what you said before. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 then rested her head against the ground and yelled in despair. A loud thud could be heard as All Might got down from the fridge and began to walk closer to a huddled over 𝗬𝗍𝗵. All Might, I'm talking about your body. All Might elaborated while continuing to take pictures. All Might's explanation caused 𝗬𝗍𝗵 to calm down. Now no longer concerned about being deemed not worthy and more so confused about what the man was talking about. Turning over her shoulder, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 looked at All Might skeptically, waiting for him to continue. All Might, my quirk, one for all, is the fullest physical ability of many people gathered into one. All Might explained, looking at 𝗬𝗍𝗵 as she absorbed the information. An unprepared body cannot inherit it fully. The limbs will be blown off and the body will explode. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, the limbs will what? 𝗬𝗍𝗵 asked, panicked. Shaking her head to clear it of any doubts or negative thoughts, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 then spoke what was on her mind. Then I'm picking up trash in order to train my body. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 asked. All Might, yes? All Might responded affirmatively, giving the girl a thumbs up. But that's not all. All Might turned around and began walking back toward the fridge 𝗬𝗍𝗵 had been trying to move. After some research on the internet yesterday, I discovered that part of this beach park's coast has been like this for many years. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, yes, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 responded absent-mindedly as she stood up and watched All Might tap the fridge with his knuckle and dent the metal. For some reason, because of the ocean currents, objects tend to drift here a lot. Because of that, people take advantage of that fact to hide their illegal dumping. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 looked around her at the sheer amount of trash that had piled up over such a long period of neglect. The local residents don't come near here either. All Might, heroes these days are all after the showy stuff. All Might spoke as he rested his hand on top of the fridge. Originally, All Might's voice showed a little strain as he began to crush the fridge with one hand, like a soda can. Being a hero meant doing volunteer service. Even if people called that boring or whatever, you can't waver from those roots. All Might had finished speaking just as he had finished crushing the fridge into a flattened metal pancake. The amount of force behind All Might's hand was enough to cause a massive gust of wind, which blew away a large chunk of trash and cleared a small portion of the view. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 could see the sun rising over the horizon, its light reflecting off the waves as they came into shore. You will restore the horizon for this whole section, All Might announced to 𝗬𝗍𝗵 as she stared in awe at the physical prowess All Might had just displayed. That is your first step toward becoming a hero. 𝗬𝗍𝗵's eyes widened as she turned to look around her. She was stunned, shocked, bamboozled if you please. The massive piles of garbage, most of which were made up of metal and other heavy materials. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 breathed in sharply as she looked at the work that was ahead of her. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, my first step? 𝗬𝗍𝗵 muttered in disbelief. Clean this, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 stammered, lost for words as she looked at the sheer amount of work she had in store. All of it? 𝗬𝗍𝗵 shouted in quasi-despair. All Might, young 𝗵𝗃𝗍𝗶, you want to go to 𝗬𝗃𝗍𝗶, right? All Might asked, looking at the stunned girl. Izumi, yes, Izumi responded quickly, turning to face All Might once again. Yes. Because it's where you went. Izumi brought a hand to her 𝗧𝗵𝗲 as if to motivate herself. So if I'm going to go, I thought it would definitely have to be you, eh? All Might, you're a go-getter fangirl? All Might said boisterously. Turning to look at the sunrise, All Might continued, but I've told you this before. It's not something you can do without a quirk. It's sad, All Might said with a sigh, but that is what the reality is. And UAS is the hardest hero course to get into. Meaning Izumi, in the 10 months until the UAS entrance exam, I have to complete my vessel. Izumi said, moving closer to All Might as she saw some of the logic behind All Might's statements. All Might, that's where this comes in. All Might exclaimed as he pulled out a few sheets of paper and tapped them with his index finger. I came up with this, the aim to pass American Dream Plan. It's a training schedule to help you finish cleaning up the beach. All Might explained as he handed the sheets over to the girl. I'll have you follow this in every aspect of your life. Izumi, even Izumi stammered as she shifted through the pages. Even the sleep time is included, All Might. Frankly, this is a super hard schedule. Do you think you can follow it? All Might came close and whispered into Izumi's ear. Izumi, of course, Izumi replied, looking once more at the sheets of paper in her hands. I have to work many times harder than anyone else, or else I won't be able to do it. Present, Izumi, right. All Might knows what he's doing. Why would I ever doubt him? He's been nothing but supportive and helpful since he talked to me that day after I tried to save Kaken, Izumi thought, wiping her brow of sweat and picking up a tire that had been discarded on the beach. Izumi then continued her jog back to the pile she had been making at the top of the stairs, near a truck that the two used to transport the trash once she had gathered enough of it. A few weeks later in Tokyo, with Izuku had taken the bullet train to Tokyo on the weekend, just like he had the past few weeks. He had been going to the shrine that was being maintained at the old campus of Tokyo Jujutsu Technical Institute in hopes that he might be able to uncover more. Though he hadn't been able to find anything in the shrine's libraries, he was able to use that space there for something he wanted to try, as the Miko priestesses and priests never ventured too far away from the shrine and the path to and from. Izuku had spent most of these past weeks immersing himself in the book that had been given to him by his grandfather, learning as much as he could about the basics of his quirk and the various applications and uses it had. A few days ago, he had finished reading the entry for the divine dogs when he discovered that there were more of these shikigami that he had access to. However, he would have to exert some effort to try and unlock that potential he still had within himself. The book spoke about performing an exorcism ritual in order to subjugate another of these shikigami. It went into detail about how to begin the ritual and what consisted of subjugating. Izuku would have to beat and destroy the shikigami using his quirk essence. Izuku figured that of all places where he might be able to have some space to himself, where he wouldn't have to worry about anyone else, to perform the ritual. Izuku had been spending the past few weeks attempting to get a grasp of the concept of quirk essence, and had been fairly successful. Although he had no real way to test it besides against Shiro and Kuma, but they didn't always want to do it. It seemed like the two reacted to Izuku's quirk essence itself as well. After getting the hang of applying and gathering quirk essence in such a manner that he could theoretically use it in the same way that the book described cursed energy. While not necessarily relying on his emotions, Izuku noticed the way his quirk energy responded to his will, flaring up when he felt excitement or anger. He had heard that some quirks remained dormant until a certain trigger had been met, and Izuku theorized that it might be that they needed a large emotional trigger to cause enough quirk essence to flare up. Something that was backed up by the study he had discovered a few weeks ago. After about an hour of walking, Izuku had managed to find the shrine, and as such he had managed to reach the campus of Tokyo Jujutsu Technical Institute. Walking around, and moving off of the normal path, Izuku wandered about. Hoping to find a decent area to work on the exorcism ritual, Izuku wandered until he found himself in the middle of a densely wooded area. Deciding that this was a fine spot, Izuku took a deep breath and looked around him. Making sure that no one was around, Izuku brought his hands together in front of him. Forming the shape of a bird with his hands, Izuku recited the words he had memorized from the book. The area around was suddenly darkened, as Izuku had begun the exorcism ritual. Izuku watched his shadow elongate as it began to rise and take shape. Izuku watched as a large owl-like creature with orange feathers and a white mask-like skull took form. Its large wings beat, taking it off of the ground and away from Izuku. Two sets of razor-sharp talons ready themselves to tear through his flesh, and human-like teeth gnash ferally as the bird-like Shikigami stares at Izuku with its piercing golden eyes. Izuku watched closely as it flew overhead, bringing his hands together once again to form the familiar hand puppet of a dog. From his shadow jumps Shiro and Kuma, both ready for the upcoming fight. Both wolves let out their howls as they watched the large bird-like creature begin its quick descent toward the ground and in the direction of Izuku, its wings sparking with an electric charge. Izuku, ready for the fight ahead, quickly flexed his legs in preparation to jump and grab onto the neck or feathers of the Shikigami. Taking a moment to steady his breath and channel the quirk essence into his hands, Izuku's focus locked on the rapidly approaching enemy. Izuku was determined to subjugate at least this one before the entrance exams. At the same time, Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, with Izumi and Toshinori. Izumi struggled as she tried to pull a large filing cabinet across the sand. She struggled and struggled as the cabinet left a massive drag mark through the sand. All Might, or Toshinori, stood nearby cheering the girl on, offering words of wisdom and support as he watched the green-haired girl putting forth her best effort in order to get the garbage moved and thrown away. Sweat poured down her brow as she jogged back to the piles of garbage after leaving the filing cabinet near the stairs. Grabbing a heavy tire, Izumi slung it over her shoulder and continued making good pace toward the stairs. Izumi, that's right, Izumi thought as she breathed heavily and struggled to push herself further. Depending on the size and shape, the muscles I have to use are completely different. I see this is. Toshinori, run. Run. Toshinori shouted from where he stood, atop a pile of garbage. 10 months will be over before you know it. Toshinori watched as the girl tripped over a small mound of sand and fell onto her. Let's become more athletic. Toshinori shouted as he watched Izumi pull herself off of the sandy ground and continue jogging to take the heavy tire to the park entrance. Izumi continued to push her body until she couldn't anymore that day. A few days later, Aldra Junior High School, with Izumi and Izuku. Izuku and Izumi sat at their desks as their teacher droned on with his boring lecture. Something about the dawn of Quirks era. His voice remained monotone as he read from the textbook at his desk at the front of the class. Izumi was struggling to remain focused and conscious in class. The amount of time and effort she was putting into her training was leaving her drained during the day at school. She was barely able to maintain focus on the class, however, as she sat at her desk and began to plan and strategize a way to make her training even more effective. The green-haired girl sat with a notebook open and the words, "Proposed Independent Training Menu" quickly scrawled across the top of the page. Izumi, this is tough, Izumi thought as she began to space out, once again, and stopped paying attention to the teacher's lecture. 10 months of this, Looking down at the open notebook in front of her, Izumi continued to think, it'll be hard if I don't finish by a week before the exam. Which means, Izumi picked up her pencil and began jotting down her thoughts and doing the math about her training schedule. There are 294 days left, taking into consideration a sufficient recovery period if I rest for 2 days in between. That gives me, Izumi eventually began muttering quietly to herself, eventually drawing everyone's attention. Izuku, similarly, had stopped paying attention to the lecture. However, unlike Izumi, Izuku wasn't trying to come up with a method for training or figuring out a timeline to work with in order to prepare for the upcoming UE entrance exams. No, Izuku was quietly scoffing under his breath at the stupidity of the lecture at hand. Instead, Izuku found himself diving into the book he brought. He was currently reading up on the Shikigami he had tried to subjugate a few days ago. Although he had been unsuccessful on his first attempt, he knew there had to be some sort of information within the book that would help him understand the Shikigami that the book called new. Continuing to read, and paying no mind to Izumi's mumblings that had grown in volume, Izuku finally found what he was looking for. He, luckily, had found the passage that described how the author, Fushiguro Megumi, had managed to subjugate the pesky bird. Izuku settled with himself that he would attempt the same tactic that his ancestor had used to tame Nu this weekend. Izuku felt more confident about it as he began to formulate his strategy for the upcoming trial he would face. Izumi's mumbling had reached a level that had become overly disruptive, resulting in the teacher using his quirk to extend his hand from the wrist and bonk Izumi on her head to bring her focus back to class. However, the statement he made following the physical reprimand made it seem like it carried a different message. History teacher, hey, Midoriya, the teacher reprimanded as he retracted his hand, did your encounter with that villain make you go crazy? The class began to chuckle to themselves as their teacher continued to passive-aggressively insult Izumi for being quirkless. It's presumptuous to think of getting into you like that? Izumi thought as she covered her mouth with her hands. The band-aids covering the blisters on her fingers clearly visible as they grew in number every day. I have to study for the entrance exam too. Chatter spread around the room as most students began to whisper and chuckle to themselves about Izumi's muttering. Clearly, there was something wrong with the quirkless girl, especially if she thought that training would get her into UA. However, a boy with ashen blonde hair merely rested his cheek on his fist as he stared out of the window. He wasn't in a good mood, but there was something preventing him from speaking up or saying anything against the girl. SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A month and a half later in the Midoriya household, with Izumi and Izuku. Izumi and Izuku had both been spending large amounts of their time out of the house. Inko had taken notice, but when she asked both teenagers, the answers she got were the same. Training for what, exactly, Inko wasn't sure. But she was surprised when a few weeks ago, Izumi had come to her and requested that she change what she made for meals. Presenting a written menu to her, Izumi looked at her mother with bright and round eyes, practically pleading with the older woman to comply with the menu. When Inko had asked Izuku what he thought, he had simply replied that she could do it if she wanted. Both of them seemed to be growing rapidly. While Izumi was quickly packing on muscle mass and definition, Izuku seemed to be diving deeper and deeper into his readings and research. He often came home from school and confined himself to his room except for meal times and his daily runs. Inko had noticed that Izuku was spending a lot of time in Tokyo, going to the large city every weekend, without fail. There were times that the boy would come back bruised and slightly bloody. However, Izuku always simply shrugged it off when Inko would ask, claiming that all they were was training injuries. Izuku's nature had also become more closed off and isolationary, often remaining neutral in most situations and choosing to distance himself from both her and Izumi. Inko had noticed it first when they all sat together to watch a movie a few weeks ago, at her request. She figured it would be nice to spend time together, as the two had been spending most of their time outside of the house, at unknown places. However, the entire time they watched the movie, Inko noticed Izuku's face remained neutral, even at the most exciting or heart-wrenching parts. He would also consistently shift his hands and flex his fingers. There were moments when Inko thought she saw an odd, flickering aura surrounding Izuku's hands at those moments, but she couldn't be sure and chose to brush it off. Today, she had made a fairly large dinner, although it seemed like both teenagers were eating much more than they had a few months ago, as it wasn't there for very long. She had also changed what she made for them, complying with Izumi's menu of healthy, fresh salads and protein-rich chicken or fish. The green-haired trio sat at the dinner table and enjoyed the meal. Izumi scarfed down her food, quickly asking for seconds, and Izuku wasn't far behind. All the while, Inko was left to wonder what these two could be doing that would leave them this famished at the end of the day. 1 month later, Tokyo Jujutsu Technical Institute campus. With Izuku had come back once again, just like always. But today felt different. Izuku had spent the last 2.5 months performing the exorcism ritual every weekend, multiple times per weekend. Izuku had been following the tactics in the book, which had gotten him close the last few times. But recently, on a reread, Izuku noticed that Fushiguro Megumi had made mention of something called cursed tools. After finding the section of Inside the Shadows, the 10 Shadows technique that talked about these cursed tools. It had informed him that these items were essentially items imbued with cursed energy and could be used in combat, sometimes as an extension of what was called an innate technique. Izuku, while I could and have been attempting to create a pseudo-curse tool, Megumi-sensei wrote that if I can get my hands on an actual curse tool, then it will be even more effective against these Shikigami. I wonder where I might be able to find one of these cursed tools. Izuku thought as he made his way through a forested area of the old campus. Izuku had indeed been attempting to make a curse tool of his own. The book had described a method of creating something akin to a curse tool. However, it did say that they were significantly weaker and less effective against things called curses. According to the book, the Shikigami were a type of curse that could be subjugated and controlled by a sorcerer, but curses themselves were monstrous creatures born from the negative emotions of humans. In his attempt to create a pseudo-curse tool of his own, Izuku had procured a set of tonfa from the shaggy, homeless-looking hero he had been in contact with and had spent the last 2 weeks pouring his quirk essence into the 2 wooden batons. A/N. These are tonfa. Izuku continued walking absent-mindedly until he came across a building. He hadn't seen this building before, although he hadn't come this way before either. Taking a look at the structure in front of him, it looked like a traditional Japanese building, with curved roofs and paper doors, though the doors had been practically ripped to shreds by the years of neglect that this building had gone through. Choosing to enter the building carefully, Izuku proceeded to look through the building. It seemed to be a single-room building with a large open room and hardwood floors. However, the presence of a small door near the back of the room led Izuku to believe otherwise. Making his way to the door, Izuku reached out for the handle and opened the door, only to find a mostly empty storage room. The only things left on the shelves were a few cases that appeared to be locked. Unsure of what to do, Izuku simply chose to leave the building and those cases alone for now, though Izuku would probably be coming back. For now, Izuku needed to perform the ritual. Setting his backpack against a nearby tree and pulling the tonfa from within, Izuku moved into a clear area. Getting himself ready, Izuku began the ritual and watched as the sky seemed to darken overhead. Watching Nu come from his shadow and take flight once again, Izuku readied himself. Today was the day that Nu would be subjugated. The same day Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, with Izumi and Toshinori. Izumi had been doing well, and Toshinori thought it was time to update her schedule. Taking the day off from cleaning the beach to explain to Izumi what she would be doing for the foreseeable future. Toshinori presented the girl with a new bundle of papers, on which he had detailed the next 5.5 months before the UHE entrance exam. Toshinori watched as the girl listened intently before asking questions of her own. She seemed so eager to do this that she had to be talked out of continuing to clean that day. Instead, Toshinori had her take the time to swim in the ocean, using that exercise to build her stamina and work on her entire body in one activity. Toshinori couldn't help but shake his head and chuckle to himself. He truly believed he found the perfect candidate to pass one for alts to. Although, at times, he found himself wondering about Izumi's brother, Izuku. Recalling their interactions on the day of the sludge villain incident and just how nonchalant he had been about everything seemed odd. After all, most kids and teens that he had interacted with as All Might would have gone crazy at the opportunity, but he seemed to disregard All Might completely. It left Toshinori to wonder. Tokyo Jujutsu Technical Institute, near an abandoned building, with Izuku. Izuku had just dodged another attack from Nu. As the bird soared back overhead, the boy breathed a small sigh of relief. The tonfa seemed to be working fairly efficiently against Nu, as the Shikigami showed signs of damage and slowing down. Izuku quickly made the decision to finish this. Summoning both Shiro and Kuma, Izuku once again readies himself for Nu's usual dive bomb attack. As Nu began its rapid descent, Izuku issued commands to Shiro and Kuma before he began to run in the other direction. Forcing Nu to give chase near the ground was Izuku's plan. As Nu reached near ground level, the Shikigami screeched in pain as it felt itself held in place by 2 large wolves. Their teeth sinking into Nu's legs and forcing it to stay in place as Izuku quickly ran up to the struggling creature and proceeded to savagely bash it with his tonfa, infusing his quirk essence into each strike as Nu screeched louder and louder. Izuku brought the tonfa down one last time, striking Nu on its head and causing it to begin to dissipate, fading back into his shadow. The sunlight, which had been strangely absent from the clearing, began to warm the area as the dark sphere surrounding the area also dissipated. He had successfully managed to subjugate Nu with plenty of time left before the entrance exams too. Third-person POV, a month and a half later, Aldra Junior High. With Izuku and Izumi, the class was busy taking notes as there were only a few more months until the final exams. Most students simply wanted to get this last bit of time done and out of the way so they could focus completely on the entrance exams to whatever high school they intended to attend. Although, for both of the Midoriyas, they could care less about the classes occurring around them. Izumi struggled to keep herself awake and focused as she dozed off while taking notes on the teacher's lecture, causing the students around her to turn and look at her in curious observation. The girl looked practically dead, with deep dark circles under her eyes and hair that seemed to get messier and messier as the days went on. Her skin was taking on a slightly darker tone, as she had been spending so much time in the sun, doing her training with all might. Only one student was looking at her with a different type of curiosity. An ash-blonde boy with piercing red eyes watched from the corners of his eyes as the girl continued to change daily. He hadn't been picking on her, but she also hadn't attempted to talk to him during this time. It was kinda getting on his nerves, the fact that she thought she could simply live her life in delusion simply because she tried to save his life that day. Izuku watched with growing disinterest at the classes occurring around him. He was ready and wanted to try and subjugate the next Shikigami, but for now had relegated himself to training with Nu. While he was getting used to the drain that summoning Nu caused, he was still eager to dive even deeper into his quirk. Especially now that he had some sort of help with it. Izuku simply watched as his teacher droned on, the information entering his mind and seemingly leaving as quickly as it came. Izuku would definitely have to do some studying on his own later, even if he had to force himself to stop reading that book. SHADOWS. Third-person POV, a month and a half later somewhere in Shizuoka Prefecture, with Izumi and Toshinori. Toshinori rode a Segway down the path cutting through the trees. Their autumn leaves painted the surroundings in appealing shades of red, gold, and yellow. Izumi followed close behind, jogging to keep up with the blonde man on the Segway. With a large metal box hoised over her shoulder, Izumi continued to press onward, even as her breathing grew shallow and the world spun around her. Gritting her teeth, Izumi focused on the sensation of each foot hitting the pavement below as she continued moving forward. Until it became too much. Toshinori heard a loud thud from behind him and turned to look over his shoulder. After bringing the Segway to a stop, Toshinori stepped off of the vehicle and looked at the girl who was lying on the ground and exhausted. Toshinori, hey, what's wrong? Toshinori asked as he stepped off of the Segway. There are only 3 months left. You won't make it at this rate. Toshinori began to raise his voice as he looked at the girl. She couldn't even pick her head off of the ground. Wanna give up? Wanna take it easy and rest today? Toshinori watched as Izumi forced her arms to pull her forward. Her body was shaking and she had reached total muscle failure way before she was meant to. Toshinori gasped and looked at the girl incredulously. Toshinori, overwork? Toshinori thought as he watched the girl's trembling arms pulling her forward. Her fingertips dragged along the pavement with all of her strength. The 𝗵𝗃 American Dream Plan was adjusted with your body in mind to make sure you'd make it in time for the entrance exam, Toshinori said after letting out a sigh, his gaze sharpening as his voice became steely. You haven't been sticking to the plan, have you? Toshinori asked seriously. Overdoing it will have the opposite effect. Toshinori chastised Izumi. Don't you want to get in? Izumi, I do, Izumi responded, her head still against the concrete, but her fists balled up in determination. But I can't just get in, I have to work a lot more than other people. Izumi's response elicited an interested hum from Toshinori, or I won't be able to catch up, Izumi said, continuing to drag her body forward with just her pure drive and willpower. I want to be like you, Izumi said, forcing her arms to push up and support her upper body as she looked at Toshinori, directly into his eyes. I want to become the greatest hero, just like you. Toshinori gasped as he looked at the girl in front of him. She was so different, yet so strikingly similar to the girl he had met 7 months prior and talked to on the roof of a building after saving her and her brother's life. Those eyes that shone with an innocent, wondrous gleam now burned with her passionate longing to move forward and become a hero. Toshinori, she's looking that far into the future, huh? Toshinori thought as he looked at Izumi. A sense of pride welled up in his Toshinori suddenly buffed up and filled out his cream-colored trench coat and olive slacks. All Might then picked Izumi up by the scruff of her jumpsuit, lifting her off of her knees and hoisting her a few inches above the ground. All Might, you go get her, fangirl. All Might said, the pride almost evident in his voice. I like that. But if that's the case, then you really can't rush things. Especially not now. But I understand your feelings. Leave it to this old guy to adjust your plan accordingly. All Might spoke, slightly shaking Izumi and hoping to bring her back to her senses. Izumi, you're not old. All Might. Izumi choked out. All Might only responded by erupting into laughter. Third-person POV. A month and a half later in Tokyo, with Izuku. Izuku was making his way through Tokyo once again, on his way to the Jujutsu Tech campus, as was his routine. He had been working constantly these past few months, specifically on attempting to finish the production of the pseudo-curse tool he was creating. Izuku had also attempted to subjugate the next Shikigami, with little to no success. There wasn't much time left, and this would be Izuku's last trip to Tokyo for the foreseeable future. With it coming down to the last weeks before the entrance exam, Izuku would need to spend these next few weeks studying and preparing for his finals as well. As much as he wanted it to just be over already, he knew that if he got bad grades on his finals or the entrance exam, he would have spent the last 10 months busting his butt with his training for nothing. Deciding that today, he would return once again to that dilapidated building and see if he could open one of those cases. If only to see what they might contain. Izuku began to make his way through the city streets until he reached the familiar pathway leading to the shrine. Izuku then climbed up to the path he had taken to get to that dilapidated building. The boy then traversed an overgrown path weaving between the trees, until he eventually found himself at the familiar building. Once again, Izuku carefully entered the building and made his way to the small door within the one-room building. Opening it slowly, hoping that the rusty metal hinges would continue to hold for just a little bit longer, this would be the last time he came here for a while. After managing to open the door without it falling off its hinges, Izuku looked at the 3 cases that sat on the dusty shelves. While the storage room was dusty, it was curiously untouched by the decay that affected the rest of the building around it. Choosing to grab all 3, Izuku pulled them out of the room and set them on the floor of the main room of the building. Looking at the 3 of them, Izuku slowly reached out to one of the cases, only to pull his hand back at the last second. Doubts began to settle into his mind. Izuku, hold on, isn't what I'm doing considered theft? Shouldn't I stop now before I do something I can't undo? Izuku thought to himself, trying to grapple with his morality at the moment to determine if he should or shouldn't continue. But these things have been in there for who knows how long. And what's more, this building is practically falling apart. It seems like nature has reclaimed this more than anything. I am not sure. Izuku looked from the cases to his hand. If he took whatever was in those cases, it would make him a thief. And not even for a good reason, purely for curiosity and wanting to possess whatever is inside. Izuku would bend to his curiosity, but wouldn't allow himself to become a thief. Izuku knew how to restrain himself, and now was the time. Izuku reached out to the case in the center. It called out to him for some reason, although he wasn't sure why. Izuku laid his hand on the case and looked for a lock of some sort. After a few minutes of looking and not finding one, Izuku tried to simply open the case, to no avail. Izuku paused for a moment, looking at the case and then at his hand itself. Izuku, maybe if I just, Izuku thought to himself as he placed his hand onto the case and channeled a small amount of his quirk essence into the object. Izuku stopped when he heard a curious sound. Click. The morning of the exam in the 𝗵𝗃𝗃 household. With Izuku woke up and looked at his alarm clock. It was 5:30 in the morning and time for him to get up and get ready for the entrance exam that day. Izuku quickly hopped out of bed and got himself ready. Pausing for a moment to go and check on Izumi to make sure she was awake and getting dressed. But when he got to her room and opened her door, He found her room completely empty. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 wasn't here. Shrugging his shoulders, Izuku went back to getting ready before going for a jog to warm up. Izuku had plenty of time to do his morning warm-up and take a quick shower before climbing the hill to get to Yuya. Izuku quickly stepped out of the door and began his jog around the block. After making it back home, Izuku took a quick shower to clean himself up before he went downstairs to make himself something to eat for breakfast. He knew that Inko wouldn't be up for another hour or so, and decided to make himself something to eat instead of stopping somewhere along his way to get it. At the same time, 𝗳𝗏𝗄 Municipal Beach Park, with 𝗬𝗍𝗵 and Toshinori had just parked the truck and stepped out. The brisk February air made his own breath visible in the chilly morning breeze. Toshinori began to make his way to the park entrance when he heard a loud, victorious scream resounding throughout the area. Toshinori turned to see the silhouette of 𝗬𝗍𝗵, standing atop the last pile of trash in just her sports bra and track. She leaned her head back as she shouted in animalistic victory, the sweat pouring down her forehead and causing her bangs to stick to her face. Toshinori quickly picked up the pace, making it to the stairs as he stared out over the view. Toshinori, hey, Toshinori said astounded as he stared out at the clean and sandy beach. She even cleaned outside of where I told her to. Seriously? There's not even a speck of dust left. Seriously? Toshinori could only stand there, stunned at the insane transformation the municipal beach park had undergone. She finished at the last minute. More than perfectly. Oh my, Toshinori stammered, lost for words. Oh my all-might goodness? Toshinori shouted as he buffed up into the all-might's form. Just over his shoulder, still standing atop the pile of garbage, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 swayed. Unable to hold her body up any longer, she collapsed, falling down and off the side of the tower of trash. In a flash, before she could even come close to hitting the ground, the muscular All Might had caught the girl in his arms. He looked down on her exhausted form with a proud smile gracing his face. All Might, good work? All Might said, looking down at the green-haired girl still cradled in his arms. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, All Might 𝗬𝗍𝗵 said, exhaustion getting the better of her. I did it. All Might, yeah, you surprised me, you joker. All Might responded cheerfully. All Might set 𝗬𝗍𝗵 on her feet, letting her stand on her own before he continued, teenagers are amazing. Here, take a look. All Might held up his phone in front of 𝗬𝗍𝗵's face. The screen displayed a picture of her from 10 months ago when she had started her training. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, huh, isn't that? 𝗬𝗍𝗵 said, lifting her head and wearily looking at the image displayed on the screen. All Might, it's you, 10 months ago? All Might said before pausing and taking a look at the amount of compact muscle 𝗬𝗍𝗵 had managed to build in that time frame. You did good. You really did. All Might exclaimed proudly. The mirage of it is finally just barely visible, but you have certainly become a suitable vessel. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 could only smile and look at her hands. She raised one hand up to look at it as it shook from the amount of effort she had put her muscles through, but still, she managed to lift her arm. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, I feel like I'm cheating, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 muttered as she looked at her hand. All Might, 𝗬𝗍𝗵, you did all this for me, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 continued, tears welling up in her eyes as her voice began to crack. I'm too blessed. All Might, what are you saying after all this time? All Might thought as he chuckled at the girl's comment. It was your own hard work. All Might patted the girl on the back as he watched the tears spill from her eyes. We'll have to fix those leaky eyes of yours. All Might joked before he looked at 𝗬𝗍𝗵 seriously. Now, it's time for the award ceremony, Midoriya 𝗬𝗍𝗵. 𝗬𝗍𝗵, yes sir. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 squeaked. All Might reached up to his hair and plucked a single strand of blonde hair from the front standing bangs he had. Holding it out to 𝗬𝗍𝗵, All Might began to speak. All Might, this is something I was once told, something that you receive because you're lucky and something that you are given because you are recognized is different in essence. All Might said, gaining 𝗬𝗍𝗵's attention as he looked at her. His smile remained the same as he looked at her proudly and continued, take that to heart. This is a power that you earned because of your own effort. 𝗬𝗍𝗵 looked at All Might as he held out the golden blonde strand of hair that blew in the wind. With a determined look and a settled nod, 𝗬𝗍𝗵 was ready to accept the gift of All Might's power. In whatever form that might take. All Might extended his hand that was holding the strand of hair. The blonde man lifted it up and smiled at the girl and said two simple words. All Might, eat this? SHADOWS. Third-person POV. A few hours later a high school, with Izuku. Izuku walked calmly toward the gate, only to hear his name being called over and over again by someone behind him. Stopping for a minute to turn around, he saw Izumi running up the hill to catch up to him. Pausing to let his sister catch up, Izuku took a moment to admire the beauty and scale of the school's campus. The large H-shaped building was made out of glass and steel that reflected the sunlight's shine this early in the morning. Izumi finally caught up to her brother and paused by his side. Breathing deeply as she jogged most of the way here and then ran to catch up to Izuku, Izumi rested her hands on her knees for a moment before looking up at Izuku. Izumi, I made it, Izumi said excitedly before she began to make her way inside. Keeping in stride with Izuku. In the end, I didn't have time to test out the power I received from All Might, Izumi thought to herself as she continued walking toward the test center. Thinking back on exactly how she got her power made her feel a little nauseous. Covering her mouth with a hand, she continued walking. Izuku trailed only a few steps behind his sister. While he didn't have anything wrong with walking side by side with the girl, she was just moving at a much faster pace than he wanted to. As far as Izuku was concerned, there was still time until the test started. Izuku paused for a moment as Izumi stopped walking and muttered something to herself. It was hard to make out, but Izuku couldn't deny that what he heard was outlandish at best. Izumi, I swallowed the hair, but did I really receive his power? Izumi muttered to herself, her voice muffled even more by her hand, which still covered her mouth. Izuku, what? What the F does that even Maya? Izuku thought in bewilderment before he was interrupted by the angry barking sound of a familiar voice. Katsuki, out of my way, Deku. Parasite. Bakugo Katsuki, the ash-blonde boy from their neighborhood and middle school. Izumi, oh Kaken? Izumi said as she turned over her shoulder to greet the boy. Katsuki, don't stand in front of me. I'll kill you. Katsuki warned, his voice rough and his eyes burning with irritation. Izumi, a morning. Let's both do our best, Izumi stammered as she waved her arms in front of her. Izuku watched in surprise as the boy didn't say anything else, he only continued walking past. Izuku and Izumi could hear the murmurs of some of the other students here to take the exam, as they noticed Katsuki from the TV and the incident with the sludge villain. Izumi simply stared at his back and muttered to herself. Izumi, ever since that day, Kaken didn't do anything to me. Izumi muttered under her breath as she watched Katsuki's back shrink as he continued walking away from her. Letting out a sigh, Izumi continued on her path forward. Making her way to the doors not long after Katsuki did. Izuku, they're both different from before? Izuku pondered aloud to himself as he turned to begin walking as well. Welp, remember these past 10 months, Izuku, the hard work and hours of your life you dedicated to this. The deals you made with that hobo to get you the stuff you needed. This is meant to be my first step, Izuku thought to himself as he turned and began to walk forward. To being a hero. Izuku stepped forward, only to have his foot catch on his other leg and send him falling face first toward the brick walkway leading toward the UE main building. Izuku, or I'll just die. Izuku thought as he watched the rapidly approaching brick walkway. Until all of a sudden, he had stopped and was floating in midair. Izuku was confused and stunned. As he stared at the ground, not getting any closer, but not getting any further. It was then that he heard it. Are you all right? A cheery female voice asked. Izuku immediately began to slightly panic, as he couldn't feel the ground under his feet either. He was just sort of suspended in midair. He began to kick his legs and try to adjust his body, but to no avail. He just ended up looking a little bit stupid. Izuku then turned to the side and saw the person who had spoken to him, and likely was the one responsible for the new disorienting feeling in his inner ear. She reached out and grabbed him, setting Izuku onto his feet before letting go and pressing her hands together. It's my quirk. Sorry for using it without asking first. The girl said. She had chestnut brown hair cut into a bob and a permanent blush on her cheeks. As she pressed her hands together, Izuku noticed the padding on the tips of her fingers. The girl flashed him a bright smile before continuing, her head to the side, "But it'd be bad luck if you fell, right?" Izuku didn't respond. He didn't know how to respond. A slight pink made its presence on his cheeks as he looked at her cheerful manner and listened to her speak. "Aren't you nervous?" she said, smiling at Izuku once again. Before Izuku could respond, however, she continued speaking again, "Let's do our best. See ya." The brunette then turned on her heel and made her way up the steps to the doors of UA and inside, leaving Izuku standing there, stunned and speechless. "Izuku, I just talked to a cute girl," Izuku thought to himself. Izuku had indeed not spoken a word. Izuku gathered himself and quickly made his way into the examination hall. Finding his seat next to Izumi, Izuku quickly made himself comfortable and readied himself for whatever would be on the written exam. Izuku sat patiently in his seat in the auditorium-like exam room as he waited for it to start. After a few moments, a massive screen showed the UA logo and drew everyone's attention toward the front of the hall. A few seconds later, a figure with spiked blonde hair and 𝗳𝗲𝗄𝗏 clothes stepped onto the stage and began to speak. "For all you examinee listeners tuning in, welcome to my show today," the man said, his voice resounding throughout the entirety of the exam hall, seemingly without any type of microphone amplification. "Everybody say Che." The man turned his head and put a hand up to his ear in anticipation of a roaring response from the crowd of examinees, only to be left standing in absolute silence. "What a refined response," the man says after a fake couch into his hand. "Now then, I'll quickly present to you the rundown on the practical exam. Are you ready?" The man once again called out, hoping for some sort of response. After receiving none, he shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "Izumi, it's the voice hero, present mic. Wow," Izumi muttered, her eyes wide and sparkling. Izuku knew this all too well, and knew she was about to begin muttering to herself again. "I listen to him every week on the radio. I'm so moved. All of the teachers at UA are pro heroes." Izuku and Katsuki, "Shut up," both said in unison, attempting to get Izumi to be quiet so that she didn't embarrass herself or them. "Present mic, as it says in the application requirements, you little listeners will be conducting 10-minute mock urban battles after this." The screen behind present mic changed to show a diagram of the various different testing sites they would have. From A to G, you can bring whatever you want with you. After the written exam, you'll head to the specified battle center. Present mic explained, leaving a break for a crowd response, only to receive silence. "Okay." Present mic repeated, hoping for at least something from the examinees. "Katsuki, in other words, they won't let you work with your friends?" Katsuki said as he looked from his card to Izumi's and Izuku's. Taking a look as well, both Izumi and Izuku noticed that the training centers were different for each examinee nearby, even though the examinee numbers were consecutive. Izumi pointed this out in hushed tones to both Katsuki and Izuku. "Katsuki, don't look. I'll kill you." Katsuki snarled at Izumi, who had looked over at his card to see that he had been assigned to City A while she was assigned to City B. "Tisk, Dimon, now I can't crush you." The image on the screen behind present mic had changed. It now displayed a clip art image of a city block, with high-rise towers and large buildings crammed into a relatively small space. Present mic, 3 different types of faux villains are stationed in each battle center. Present mic explained as everyone directed their attention to the handout they had been given about the practical portion of the exam. An image accompanied by the point value appeared on the screen for the 1, 2, and 3 pointers as present mic continued the explanation. You earn points for each of them based on their difficulty. Your goal, dear listeners, is to use your quirks to earn points by immobilizing the faux villains. Of course, present mic turned and pointed to the crowd. Attacking other examinees and any other unheroic actions are prohibited. "May I ask a question?" A boy with blue hair and glasses stood and raised his hand stiffly. He had practically shouted his request, but Izuku couldn't blame him. The room was massive. "Present mic." Present mic responded, giving a thumbs up and the floor to the young man with blue hair. A spotlight from the ceiling shone down on the boy, giving everyone a clear look at his appearance. "Izuku, I know that uniform isn't that 𝗬𝗵𝗲 uniform. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 wondered as he looked at the boy who had the question. On the printout, there are 4 types of villains. The boy with glasses spoke, pointing to the printout in question. If this is a misprint, then 𝗬𝗍𝗐, the most prominent school in Japan, should be ashamed. We examinees are here in this place because we wish to be molded into exemplary heroes. The boy practically shouted, before he turned over his shoulder and violently pointed at 𝗧𝗵𝗲. In addition, you over there with the curly hair. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at one another before pointing at themselves and returning the boy's gaze. You've been muttering this whole time? The boy with blue hair reprimanded. It's distracting. If you're here on a pleasure trip, then you should leave immediately. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 quickly covered her mouth and lowered her head, quickly apologizing as students around her began to quietly giggle at the outburst and the fact that she had been called out so brazenly in front of everyone. Present mic. Okay. Examinee number 7111. Present mic called out, waving his hands to try and calm the situation down, even just a little bit. Thanks for the great message. The 4th type of villain is worth 0 points. Present mic explained, that guy's an obstacle, so to speak. There's one in every battle center, an obstacle that will go crazy in narrow spaces. It's not impossible to defeat, but there's no reason to defeat it either. I recommend that you little listeners try to avoid it. Thank you very much. Please excuse the interruption. The boy with glasses said as he bowed respectfully before sitting back down. Murmurs quickly began spreading through the crowd of examinees. Comparisons to video games and other simple connections. It made it easier for most of them to understand the pointlessness of attempting to fight the 0-pointer. Present mic, that's all from me. Finally, before you begin the written exam, I'll give you listeners a present our school motto. Present mic announced, the hero Napoleon Bonaparte once said, a true hero is someone who overcomes life's misfortunes. Go beyond. Present mic paused for a moment, knowing that this was a moment that really got into the heads of the examinees, plus ultra. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at the handout with a gleam in her eye and a nervous grin on her face. She was excited, she was ready, and she was going to pass. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at the handout and then at some of the other people taking the exam, wondering what their quirks could be, and wondered what the possibility of another host quirk being in this massive group of potential hero students was. Present mic. Now, everyone, good luck suffering. Present mic announced as he left the room and the written exams were being distributed. About 2 hours later at Fake City Beta, with 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stood in the crowd of other examinees who were waiting for the gate to open and the practical exam to start. Staring up at the massive metal gates that kept them outside of the city, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 couldn't help but get nervous. The weight of dread in the pit of her stomach made it hard for her to think, but she still managed to collect her thoughts. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, it's time to do it. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 thought to herself, it's time to give everything I got from my training with all might these past 10 months. I will become. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 thinks nervously as she looks around and sees the boy with blue hair and glasses who had reprimanded her in the examination hall standing nearby and a girl with chestnut brown hair cut in a bob just a short distance away. The hero I always dreamed of being. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 smacks her cheeks to get rid of the doubt and fear beginning to take root in her, preparing herself for when the exam began. At the same time at Fake City Delta, with 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked around at the other examinees here with him. He had taken the opportunity to size up the competition and formulate some sort of strategy in his head. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 knew that the teachers were probably going to be watching the practical exams closely. He wanted to show out just enough to make sure that homeless hero, as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had begun to call him, was satisfied. He had told 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to make sure to get at least 30 villain points, and that was exactly what 𝗧𝗵𝗲 intended to do. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, remember 𝗧𝗵𝗲, this isn't just for you. It's for mom too. This is the first step to gaining control over that thing. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 thinks to himself as he continues to scan the others around him. Tightening his grip on the tonfa he brought with him, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 narrowed his eyes as he waited for the slightest crack in the massive metal gate preventing them from entering the battle center. Shiro, Kuma, are you ready? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 wondered, feeling the two wolves bursting at the seams with excitement. The opportunity to run wild, so to speak, was exhilarating and only served to make them more eager. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 smiled subtly, rolling up the sleeves of his dark blue tracksuit. The wooden tonfa held securely against his forearms as he rolled his shoulders in a last-second stretch, ready to rush into the battle center the moment the gate opened. SHADOWS. Shadows. 2 tents, divine dogs, 2 wolves, 1 white and 1 black, which manifest from the wielder's shadow. Summoned by performing a wolf hand seal, or shadow puppet. Both are capable of tearing humans and animals apart with their fangs and devouring them. Each of the dogs can detect enemies and items and notify their 𝗵𝗃𝗃 when one is close. Their tracking abilities allow them to find lost allies and locations as well. New, a winged Shikigami armed with great speed and electric shock wings. Summoned by performing a bird hand seal, or shadow puppet. It can support its MSTR by carrying them while flying to increase their mobility, and can attack with its heavy wings charged with electricity, shocking anyone it hits and leaving them temporarily paralyzed. It's especially effective for taking opponents posted in high places off guard or in combination attacks with other Shikigami. In addition to basic offensive applications, new speed and wings can also be used defensively to shield its MSTR from harm.